Hello, my dear friends. They said Victorian women went mad on their own, but they forgot to mention who handed them the bottle. What if the so-called cure that promised calm was the very thing that hollowed their minds, one sweet drop at a time? Beneath corsets and lace, thousands of women were slowly poisoned in the name of medicine, and the empire called it elegance. Their madness wasn't born, it was prescribed. Tonight, we'll walk through those quiet rooms and uncover how comfort became the deadliest weapon of all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step into a Victorian pharmacy, the first impression would be of trust. Glass bottles lined the shelves, each filled with amber liquid, each labelled with elegant script that promised relief. Behind the counter stood men in pressed coats, their calm manners giving the illusion of science and care for women, especially those told their nerves were fragile or their emotions too strong. This was a sanctuary, a place where pain could be named, measured, and silenced with a teaspoon. The liquid that gleamed softly under the gaslight was laudanum, a mixture of alcohol and opium, and it was prescribed for nearly everything. It soothed menstrual pain, eased sleeplessness, dulled sadness, and quieted rebellion. Doctors believed women's bodies were ruled by unstable wombs and restless minds, so the bottle became their answer to everything they did not understand. The drug was sold freely, without restriction or caution. It appeared on the same shelves as cough syrups and tonics, bought alongside soap or tea. Mothers kept it in drawers, wives carried it in handbags, and daughters learned its comfort before they learned the alphabet. A few drops in warm water could make the body still and the mind distant. For a moment, the world grew softer, kinder, easier to bear. It is almost funny, in a dark way, that an empire obsessed with control found its calm in a bottle of liquid chaos. The doctors wrote prescriptions with neat precision, but none of them truly knew what they were giving. To them, laudanum was medicine. To women, it became both escape and prison. Victorian society was built on restraint. Women were expected to smile through pain, to speak softly, to keep the household perfect. When they trembled, wept or raged, it was called hysteria. The cure, of course, was more laudanum. It dulled their anger and softened their voice until they were once again acceptable. There was no talk of side effects, no warning of dependence. Addiction was not a word yet understood. The same liquid that allowed a woman to endure her duties slowly made her unable to live without it. If this existed today, it would be like buying a bottle of morphine at the supermarket, labelled as soothing tonic for ladies. The absurdity is easy to see now, but in those years, the line between healing and harm barely existed. The drug carried a strange beauty. The bottle shimmered in the light, its colour like honey, its scent faintly floral. Even the act of pouring it was ritualistic, measured, and graceful. Mothers taught daughters how to mix it with tea, how to count the drops carefully. A teaspoon meant rest, 2 meant oblivion. The elegance of the gesture hid the violence within. I can almost picture the quiet satisfaction of those doctors, proud of their prescriptions, never realizing they were numbing an entire generation of women into obedience. The silence that followed each dose was praised as calm, not recognized as surrender. Inside the home, laudanum settled into daily life like wallpaper. It sat near the sewing kit, the Bible, and the bottle of ink. Women used it when the children cried too much, when the husband shouted, when the loneliness grew heavy. It was both a comfort and a cage. Husbands approved of it. Doctors encouraged it, and advertisements called it a blessing for the delicate. The more it was trusted, the deeper it took root. By the time symptoms of dependence appeared, it was too late. A trembling hand reaching for the bottle was just another sign, they said, of female weakness in wealthier homes. Laudanum was mixed into perfumes and elixirs, disguised in elegant decanters, in poorer ones. It was stored in reused glass jars passed between neighbours when someone fell ill. Its reach was endless. No one questioned its presence because everyone used it. Respectable women, housemaids, and even governesses each had their secret measure of relief. The same liquid flowed through the veins of every household, connecting rich and poor in shared quiet ruin. What made it worse was that it never seemed dangerous. Its danger was invisible, polite, and patient. Newspapers occasionally printed warnings about accidental overdoses, yet most people dismissed them as isolated misfortunes. After all, what harm could come from something sold so openly? The medical establishment did not intervene. The line between healer and dealer was thin. For every woman who lost herself in the haze, another was handed a new bottle and told to rest. The ritual of dosing became part of womanhood itself. It was expected, even admired, that a woman could hold her composure through the soft help of the medicine. The culture of skillets helped the illusion endure. To admit addiction was to confess moral failure. So they hid it. Behind drawn curtains and closed doors, women drifted between sleep and wakefulness. They performed their duties half awake, their smiles faint and voices fading. Life became something distant, dreamlike, and blurred at the edges. The empire praised its women for patience and gentleness, never realizing those virtues were chemically induced. It is hard not to feel unease imagining those rooms, dimly lit by oil lamps, where mothers took small sips of poison and called it peace. They believed it was care, that it was progress, that it was what refined society expected of them. The truth was simpler and crueler. It was obedience bottled and sold under the name of medicine. The first step toward madness came not with screams, but with quiet gratitude. The doctors claimed they were healing women, but what they truly did was erase them. The comfort that filled each bottle was never kindness, only convenience. Somewhere between one dose and the next, the line between treatment and control disappeared. The story of laudanum began with faith in science, and it ended with women forgetting who they were. It was not a single tragedy, but the opening of a wound that would take generations to close, and before anyone realized, the poison had already become part of daily life. The bottles looked innocent, almost lovely, standing in tidy rows behind shop windows and on kitchen shelves. Their labels were colourful, embossed with gold letters and tiny flowers that promised calm, rest, and relief. Some showed urns, others elegant women holding babies, as if holiness itself approved of their contents. Inside was laudanum, the same mixture of opium and alcohol that doctors prescribed for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Yet now it had taken on a new disguise, no longer just a medicine. It was a comfort, a luxury, a habit that slipped quietly into daily life without anyone naming it for what it was. Women began to drink it as they might drink tea. A spoonful in the morning soothed the nerves. Another at night helped sleep come faster. The taste was bitter, so they mixed it with syrup or wine. The sweetness masked the poison. It is oddly comical that something sold to create calmness was, in truth, stirring chaos inside their veins. The gentle drowsiness it brought became addictive, and the silence it promised felt safe. Every dose blurred the edges of reality a little more, until they no longer knew where pain ended and dependence began. These bottles were beautiful because they had to be. They were designed to look pure, trustworthy, and even fashionable. Apothecaries displayed them proudly, and advertisements called them the friend of the delicate. Housewives spoke about them the way one might discuss perfumes. They shared recipes for tonics and syrups, never realizing each drop carried a shadow. The glass shimmered under the light, reflecting domestic comfort while hiding decay. The lie was perfect because it was wrapped in beauty. If we compare it to now, it would be like buying a soft drink that tastes of fruit but quietly destroys your heart with every sip. The deceit is so ordinary that it becomes invisible. The body adjusted quickly. What began as 1 spoonful became 2, then 3. The body demanded more to feel the same calm, and when it was denied, trembling and sickness followed. Women described weakness, headaches, and sadness. So doctors prescribed more of the very thing that caused it. The circle was complete before anyone saw it. Husbands found it convenient. A quiet wife was easier to manage than one who questioned or wept. Children learned to fetch the bottle when their mothers grew restless. Addiction became part of family routine, absorbed into the rhythm of ordinary life. I can imagine the quiet horror of realizing that these bottles, polished and beautiful, were the slowest kind of poison, one that didn't kill the body immediately but gently took away the soul. The women who drank from them did not look like addicts. They looked proper, composed, respectable. Their decline was polite, almost graceful, hidden under lace and civility. Their hands trembled slightly, their eyes dulled, but no one asked why. To question was to be improper, and propriety mattered more than truth. Some women carried the bottle in their handbags, taking small doses during visits or at church. Others kept it by the bedside, where it became a companion through long nights of loneliness. It was medicine, comfort, and confession in one. Society admired their calmness, never realizing it was purchased drop by drop. The irony was complete. The very culture that demanded restraint had created its perfect tool for staunce. The women who followed its rules most faithfully were the ones it consumed first. Doctors noticed the patterns but rarely spoke of them. To admit harm was to question their own authority, so they continued prescribing, printing pamphlets, and selling hope in glass containers. When patients collapsed, they blamed weakness or a female temperament. The words addiction and withdrawal did not yet belong to medicine. They were whispered like moral failings. A woman could die from the cure without anyone calling it murder. The danger of laudanum lay not just in its chemistry, but in the way society accepted it as virtue. Newspapers occasionally mentioned deaths, but did so with delicate language. Overcome by nervous exhaustion or taken suddenly ill were phrases that appeared again and again. The public read them without understanding. It was easier to imagine a mystery illness than to confront the reality of poisoned serenity. The empire thrived on illusions of progress, of morality, of safety, and this drug fit perfectly among them. No scandal could survive long in a world that refused to see what it did not want to believe. In parlours and drawing rooms, the bottles gleamed under the lamplight. They were part of the furniture, part of the image of refinement. The gentle sound of the cork being removed became a familiar whisper in the quiet hours. It was the music of surrender, played softly and without protest. By the time the body was ruined, the mind had already forgotten what it felt like to be awake. The syrup-like sweetness that coated each drop hid a deep betrayal. The very thing meant to heal was carefully designed to keep women dependent, docile, and quiet. Each bottle was not a cure but a mirror, reflecting how easily beauty can disguise decay. The poison's prettiest disguise had taken hold, and women were falling under its spell without a trace of fear. Somewhere behind the shimmer of glass and gold, the line between habit and hunger began to vanish, and what waited beyond that line was far darker than anyone dared to imagine. Hysteria was the word that explained everything and nothing in Victorian Britain. It became the most convenient label for women who did not behave as expected. A woman who laughed too loudly, wept without permission, or refused her husband could be said to suffer from hysteria. The diagnosis was elastic enough to fit anyone who made others uncomfortable. Doctors spoke about it as if it were a disease of the womb, an inner mischief that turned obedience into defiance. The solution, they claimed, was simple rest, silence, and medicine, and the medicine, once again, was laudanum. The same bottle that promised calm now became the cure for rebellion. It was a clever system. The men who defined the illness were the same ones who sold the remedy. There was no need for proof or testing, A husband's complaint could be enough for a prescription. A mother's worry could justify another dose. It is almost amusing, in a bitter way, that the only illness exclusive to women just happened to make them easier to live with. The line between treatment and punishment disappeared. The word hysteria was spoken with sympathy, but served as a warning: be calm, be quiet, or be cured. The treatment rooms were cold and orderly. Women lay on couches while doctors took notes about their nerves. They were told to breathe deeply, to rest, to trust. Drops of laudanum were placed on their tongues, and soon their bodies softened, their minds faded. What looked like relief was simply sedation. The more they slept, the less they resisted. When they stopped speaking altogether, it was considered progress. The physician called it recovery, though it was closer to erasure. If this were to happen today, it would be like prescribing tranquilizers to every woman who questions her boss or argues with her husband. The absurdity is obvious now, but then it was law disguised as care. Every sigh, every moment of tiredness could be turned into a medical condition. The cure was always the same: control. Society used the language of health to mask the machinery of obedience. The more civilized the empire appeared, the more efficient its silencing became. At home, families followed the doctor's advice. Bottles of medicine stood beside the Bible, each symbol of faith reinforcing the other. Women took their doses faithfully, believing they were doing the right thing. The body weakened, the spirit dimmed, and still they said thank you. Husbands praised the calm that settled over the house. Servants whispered about how peaceful the mistress had become. In truth, she was simply too drugged to protest. I find it deeply unsettling how the same culture that prized female virtue also created an illness to punish it. What they called hysteria was often only unhappiness, grief, or exhaustion, but in a world ruled by appearances, those emotions had no place. The institutions that claimed to heal were filled with these quiet figures. They were given sedatives, electric baths, or endless instructions to rest. Some stayed for weeks, others for years. Their letters home were polite, vague, and detached. Over time, their handwriting weakened, their words shortened. They wrote of feeling better, but the meaning of the word changed. Better no longer meant free of pain, it meant compliant. The drug did not remove suffering, it merely buried it under layers of sleep. Doctors kept records describing miraculous improvements. They wrote of patients becoming calm, polite, and manageable. The reports read like manuals on how to turn women into furniture present, polished and sealant. The medical profession congratulated itself on its success, never realizing it had simply created a society of ghosts. The more advanced the treatments became, the less human their patients seemed. In drawing rooms, people spoke kindly about women recovering from their nerves. The phrase carried respectability, as if being drugged into stillness were a form of grace. There was comfort in believing that science could mend the chaos of emotion. Newspapers published stories of miraculous cures, though none mentioned what happened after the final dose. No one wanted to see the blank eyes, the trembling hands, or the long hours of staring into nothing. Silence was considered a symptom of health. By the late century, hysteria became both a medical trend and a social weapon. The label justified every form of control. A woman could be sent away, restrained, or medicated at the will of her family. Her protest only confirmed her diagnosis. The logic was airtight to deny the illness was proof that she had it. It was a system designed to win every argument before it began. The tragedy was not only in the suffering, but in how ordinary it became. No one questioned why half the population required constant sedation. No one asked why peace in a household depended on a corked bottle. The empire liked to think of itself as enlightened, but its medicine revealed a deep fear of feeling. Women's emotions were treated as contagion, something to be cleansed with chemicals. In doing so, an entire century mistook suppression for serenity. The label of hysteria turned women into patients, their emotions into pathology, and their independence into illness. What began as a diagnosis ended as a sentence, passed quietly under the authority of medicine. It was not madness that spread through society. but the fear of women who refused to stay small. The illusion of healing had taken hold so deeply that no one could see the damage anymore. The word cure had lost its meaning, replaced by submission written in the doctor's own hand. And somewhere beyond the hospital walls, another form of madness was waiting to be born. It began quietly, inside the well-kept homes where mothers believed they were protecting their daughters. The first signs of adolescence, restlessness, curiosity, and sudden moods were treated as warning signals. Doctors described them as the early symptoms of nervous imbalance. Families accepted it without question. A girl of 12 who laughed too loudly or argued too often was said to be overstimulated. The cure, as always, was medicine. Laudanum, the trusted friend of women, now became the teacher of girls. A few drops in milk, a spoonful before bed, a habit disguised as care. It was the beginning of a lifelong dependence, born out of love and ignorance. Mothers were told they were doing the right thing. Magazines printed gentle advice about calming a child's nerves. Bottles labelled for delicate constitutions were marketed as safe for the young. The instructions said to soothe, not to sedate, but the line was thin and invisible. It's grimly ironic that a society terrified of female desire found comfort in giving its daughters opium to keep them quiet. The girls who once ran freely through gardens now sat still for hours, their eyes half closed, their thoughts dissolving into haze. The silence pleased everyone. The mother felt reassured. The doctor called it an improvement. The child learned to drift. The drug worked quickly. What began as nightly doses soon extended into daytime routines. Mothers added a few drops whenever the child seemed anxious or too lively. Within months, the body craved it. The pupils shrank, the appetite faded, and sleep came without dreams. When the effects wore off, irritability returned, so the cycle continued. The mother thought she was maintaining peace. In truth, she was watching her daughter slip further away with every dose. The girl grew pale and thin, her laughter replaced by stillness. If something similar existed today, it would be like giving tranquilizers to a child for talking too much, and then admiring her for being calm. The cruelty hides easily behind the word good. The advertisements helped to normalize the practice. Illustrations showed serene mothers and obedient daughters, both smiling faintly, with a bottle on the table between them. The message was unmistakable discipline disguised as care. The product promised to restore natural harmony, as if nature itself had made a mistake that needed correction. Mothers who doubted themselves were reminded by doctors and neighbours that every respectable household used the same remedy. To question it was to risk being seen as ignorant. So they poured another spoonful and called it love. Inside the home, the ritual became part of life. After dinner, as candles flickered, the mother would mix the liquid into a cup. The child swallowed it dutifully, her lips stained faintly by the amber syrup. Soon she learned to ask for it herself. The mother mistook this for trust. Dependence disguised itself as affection. When the girl began to lose focus or forgot her lessons, the doctor said it was natural fatigue, another sign that more rest was needed. More rest always meant more medicine. I can almost feel the chill of that trust, the mother believing she was soothing her daughter while unknowingly taking away her future. The tragedy was not in cruelty but in faith. There were signs that something was wrong, but they were easy to ignore. The child moved more slowly, spoke less, and flinched from sunlight. She seemed fragile, delicate, and strangely calm. Visitors whispered that she was angelic. So gentle for her age. Praise replaced alarm. The appearance of purity mattered more than health. When the child's hands began to tremble, it was called nerves again. The doctor reassured them that it would pass. He increased the dose slightly, confident in his own expertise. The bottle emptied faster, but no one counted. Some mothers kept diaries of their daughter's recovery, writing about how peaceful the household had become. The entries read like hymns of devotion, filled with pride and relief. None of them saw the addiction forming beneath the surface. They wrote about quiet mornings and long naps, not realizing those naps were a symptom of poisoning. In some homes, several daughters followed the same path. Laudanum became a family tradition. handed down like a secret recipe. Each generation inherited both the drug and the silence that protected it. In rare cases, the effects were too severe to hide. A child would collapse or wake in confusion, unable to speak. Panic would rise briefly, then fade when the doctor assured the family it was simply exhaustion. The treatment continued. When death came, it was recorded as natural causes or a weak heart. No one questioned how a 12-year-old could die so peacefully, so completely, without struggle. In the Empire's statistics, these girls were invisible. Society praised the obedient child and blamed the unruly one. The drug made it easy to manufacture obedience. Girls were taught to associate calm with goodness, to see sleep as virtue. By the time they reached womanhood, the bottle was already part of their identity. It shaped their nerves, their moods, their sense of self. They could not imagine life without it. The mothers had not raised daughters. They had raised dependents, moulded by medicine and fear of emotion. It was the quietest kind of inheritance, a lineage of numbness. The horror lies not only in what was done, but in how gently it was done. There were no screams, no punishment, no visible cruelty, just the slow replacement of will with chemistry. Victorian society managed to control its women long before they became adults, not through violence, but through comfort that killed. It was not rebellion they feared most, but awareness. The mothers who believed they were protecting their daughters were, unknowingly, their first captors. The liquid calm they offered was a trap disguised as affection, and its sweetness hid the cost of innocence. Generation after generation, the Empire taught its women to sleep through their own lives. The daughters who grew up on laudanum would one day pass it to their children, believing the same myths their mothers believed. And somewhere between love and ignorance, the poison began to taste like tradition. Opium had become more than medicine. It was an accessory, an extension of what it meant to be a respectable woman. The bottles no longer belonged only to the sick. They appeared in vanity tables beside perfumes and powders, as if part of daily beauty. Society called it refinement, not dependence. Women who used laudanum were seen as delicate, cultured, and well-bred. They were praised for their composure, for their calm, for never raising their voice. The stillness that came from the drug was mistaken for grace. In parlours and salons, a faint air of drowsiness passed for elegance, the sign of a woman too refined to be troubled by the noise of the world. The image of femininity was built on quiet suffering. The ideal woman endured, smiled faintly, and never complained. Laudanum made this ideal easy to maintain. A few drops before social visits, another before bed, and the mask of serenity held firm. The hollow behind it remained unseen. It is almost absurd that addiction could be mistaken for virtue. Yet in Victorian society, numbness was the highest form of good behaviour. The Empire admired control, not vitality. A woman who trembled was weak. A woman who floated through her days with half-lidded eyes was admirable. The line between dignity and decay vanished under the weight of expectation. Advertisements understood this perfectly. They did not sell medicine. They sold an image. Posters showed graceful women reclining in silk gowns, a bottle resting on the bedside table. The captions promised gentle relief for the refined lady or soothing comfort for the sensitive heart. The implication was clear, true femininity required fragility. Those who felt too much, who thought too deeply, were out of place. The drug transformed emotion into decoration, sadness into softness. If this existed now, it would be like branding antidepressants as luxury cosmetics, with gold labels and promises of elegance. The idea sounds monstrous, but it worked beautifully in its time. At gatherings, conversations often began with talk of nerves and remedies. Women compared brands and dosages the way others discussed fabrics or jewellery. The shared weakness became a form of social bonding. Men listened with amusement, pleased that their wives were calm, polite, and endlessly agreeable. The drug had turned emotion into something ornamental, a faint blush of melancholy to complement the lace. It was not simply accepted, it was expected. To be untouched by laudanum was to be unsophisticated, even unfeminine. I find it haunting how society dressed its cruelty in elegance, teaching women to equate silence with beauty. Behind the soft tones of conversation, behind the polished manners, there was exhaustion. The women who smiled the most were often those who could barely feel their own faces. Their stillness was not peace but paralysis. The empire called it poise, but it was closer to mourning. Every glass of wine, every gentle nap, carried traces of opium and habit. It was not the body they were perfecting, it was the illusion. The deeper tragedy was that the drug fit perfectly into the rhythm of womanhood. It was there for menstrual pain, for sleeplessness, for sorrow, for anything that could not be spoken aloud. The label for ladies was not a warning but an invitation. Society never asked whether women were using too much. It only cared that they remained calm, as long as they smiled, dressed well, and avoided scandal. No one questioned the shaking hands or the glassy eyes. The world preferred its women quiet, and laudanum was the perfect instrument of quietness. Doctors contributed to the illusion. They spoke of female nerves as delicate instruments that required careful tuning. The drug, they said, restored harmony. What it truly did was erase dissonance. A woman who stopped arguing, stopped feeling, and stopped resisting was considered cured. Husbands thanked the doctors for their work. Friends praised the lady's new composure. No one wondered where her laughter had gone, or why her voice now trembled with fatigue. The empire was built on progress, yet it celebrated a medicine that dragged half its women backward into silence. The idea of the opium woman became part of art and literature. Poets wrote about her pale beauty, her tragic calm, her dreamlike presence. Pain was romanticized, sleep idealized, and decay turned into a symbol of refinement. Painting showed women in soft light, half awake, their faces serene. The reality was far less graceful constipation, shaking, and endless fatigue, but the myths were stronger than the truth. To the public eye, opium turned women into angels. In private, it turned them into shadows. Among the wealthy, laudanum use became almost ceremonial. After dinner, while men smoked cigars, women retired to their rooms with bottles of medicine and polished silver spoons. They believed they were caring for themselves, balancing their health. In reality, they were dissolving slowly, their lives measured not in years but in doses. Addiction was not hidden behind shame, it was hidden behind luxury. The more refined the household, the stronger the poison that ran quietly beneath its elegance. The poor, too, adopted the habit, but without the silk or the excuses. They bought smaller bottles, cheaper mixtures, and used them for relief from hunger or grief. Society judged them harshly for it, calling them weak and immoral. The same addiction that made rich women graceful made poor women shameful. Respectability, it seemed, depended on the quality of the bottle, not the suffering it caused. In every class, the drug served the same purpose: to mute the living into something manageable. The empire's idea of femininity was built on sedation. Laudanum became the liquid form of obedience, wrapped in glass and decorated with roses. The women who consumed it disappeared quietly behind their own smiles. It was not health they were preserving, but the illusion of perfection. The sweet calm of laudanum had become part of what it meant to be a woman. But beneath that calm, something restless was beginning to stir, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer protect them, and when that moment came, it would tear the mask apart. In the grand houses of the Victorian elite, silence carried the weight of expectation. Behind tall windows and heavy drapes, women moved through their routines like ghosts of grace, each action measured, each word chosen with care. They were mothers, hostesses, wives of men whose names opened doors. They attended dinners, signed letters, and oversaw servants, but beneath the surface ran a current of exhaustion that never found a voice. In those polished halls, laudanum was the secret companion that kept everything from collapsing. It rested inside crystal cabinets, hidden between perfumes and letters, waiting for the moment when composure began to crack. The women of the upper class were prisoners of comfort. Their days were filled with duties disguised as privileges. Morning calls, charity events, lessons for the children, all conducted with the soft smile that society demanded. But beneath their corsets and jewels, many carried the weight of loneliness and fatigue. They could not speak of despair, to do so would be vulgar, so they reached for the bottle. A small glass of laudanum made the heart lighter, the mind duller, the hours shorter. It blurred the sharp edges of their confinement and replaced thought with floating calm. It is strangely ironic that the women most admired for their elegance were often held together only by the opium that numbed them. Each evening followed the same quiet ritual. After the children were put to bed, after the last guest had gone, a servant would bring a small silver spoon and a glass of amber liquid. The lady of the house would sit before her mirror, her reflection glowing faintly under the gaslight. The first sip burned softly, spreading warmth through her chest. The second erased the noise of thought. Within minutes, her eyes lost their focus, her posture softened, and her face settled into perfect stillness. It was not peace, it was a pause. The world disappeared for a few hours, and she called it rest. If we compare it to now, it would be like sipping perfume each night to stay calm, knowing it might kill you, yet doing it anyway because the world expects you to smile. Addiction for the noblewoman was not about pleasure. It was about survival within the golden cage of reputation. Her husband noticed her quietness and took it as a virtue. Her friend saw her pallor and called it refinement. The dullness in her eyes became a symbol of poise. No one asked what it cost to appear so composed. The drug turned pain into decorum, and society applauded. In letters that survive from the time, the tone is almost always the same: grateful, resigned, tired. Women wrote of restoratives and little helps that made life bearable. They described sleep that felt like grace. Though it was closer to oblivion, the language was careful, never admitting dependence. To confess weakness was to betray one's class, so they used euphemisms, nerves, fatigue, melancholy. Each word softened the truth, turning addiction into etiquette. I can almost picture them, seated in quiet parlours, pretending to mend embroidery while their minds drifted somewhere beyond the fabric of the world. Their stillness was not patience, it was paralysis. The servants saw more than anyone else. They prepared the mixtures, fetched the bottles, and watched their mistresses fade a little more each day, but they too kept silent. To speak was to risk dismissal. In these houses, addiction did not shout, it whispered. The more respectable the woman, the quieter her decline, death. When it came, it was discreet. The newspapers described it as unexpected faintness or sleep from which she did not wake. Morning followed the same pattern: solemn, dignified, unspoken. The cause was never discussed. The illusion of grace survived even as its keepers vanished. The tragedy was layered beneath beauty. The marble floors, the velvet curtains, the scent of roses all concealed the slow erosion of feeling. The women who floated through these rooms were untouched by the dirt of labour, but consumed by a subtler form of suffering. They envied the freedom of their maids, the noise of the street, the vulgarity of real life. Yet they could not step beyond the walls built for them. Laudanum gave them the illusion of escape, even as it tightened the invisible chains. In gatherings, they spoke softly of literature and gardens, their voices calm and melodic. The trembling of their hands was hidden under lace gloves. Their laughter came half a second too late, as if travelling from a distant room inside their own minds. No one saw the distance growing between their body and their being. They were alive, yet absent. The drug did not simply dull pain, it dulled existence itself. It made survival effortless and life meaningless. The husbands, preoccupied with politics or business, rarely noticed the transformation. As long as their wives maintained the house and appeared composed, nothing seemed amiss. Some even encouraged the habit, calling it a civilized relief. To To them, the drug was another convenience, like a servant or a clock, something that kept order running smoothly. In this way, addiction became part of the architecture of aristocratic life. Invisible but essential, doctors continued to visit, bringing new bottles with polite concern. They noted improvement in tone, better rest, and fewer emotional disturbances. Each visit deepened the dependence they pretended to treat. The women thanked them graciously, their voices calm and empty. Gratitude was the last emotion that survived. The rest had been washed away long ago. The quiet elegance of these women was not grace but surrender. Laudanum became the secret that kept their world from breaking apart, a thread of poison woven into silk. They did not lose control, they were trained to lose it beautifully. Their calm was an act, perfected until it became real. One by one, the grand houses filled with the same hollow silence, the same perfume of despair hidden beneath roses. And somewhere in that silence, the empire's most beautiful illusions began to crack, revealing what it had cost to keep them alive. The advertisements were everywhere, in newspapers, on posters, and even printed on the backs of prayer cards. They promised safety in elegant fonts and gentle words. Each label glowed with authority. There were doctors in spotless coats, nurses with serene smiles, and sometimes even divine figures, angels holding bottles, the Virgin Mary surrounded by soft light. The message was simple and persuasive. Laudanum was pure, moral, and safe. For mothers, it was love in liquid form. For daughters, it was refinement. For children, it was comfort. There was no warning, no fine print, and no mention of the word poison, only reassurance, repeated so often it became truth. Victorian advertising understood its audience. It spoke in the language of care and faith. Two things women were taught never to doubt. The slogans promised gentle sleep, peaceful nerves, and rest for the tender heart. No one questioned how the same liquid could claim to cure both grief and childbirth pain, both headaches and hysteria. It is almost laughable that these campaigns were built on trust in doctors who rarely knew what they were prescribing. The bottles looked official, sealed with gold lettering, the words recommended by medical experts printed like blessings. There was no law to question them, no system to test their claims. The beauty of the label became the proof of its safety. Mothers read these advertisements while sitting by the fire, their children playing nearby. The illustrations showed happy families, glowing health, and radiant calm. The unspoken promise was that a few drops could make life easier. Tiredness would fade, tempers would soften, and the chaos of daily life would quiet down. The image of the perfect home was inseparable from the bottle that made it possible. If something similar existed today, it would be like seeing painkillers advertised as the secret to family harmony. The idea sounds absurd, yet it thrived because it fit the dream people wanted to believe. The tone of the advertisements was gentle, never urgent. They spoke not to illness, but to aspiration. For the lady who desires refinement, one label read. For the mother who gives her best, said another. Even the typography was graceful, looping like silk ribbon, softening the reality it described. Every visual detail was designed to erase doubt. It was not just a product, it was an identity. To buy laudanum was to belong to a certain class, a certain kind of woman, calm, clean, respectable, and so the poison spread under the cover of civility. I find it chilling how easily comfort can be marketed as salvation. These women believed in the authority of printed words the way they believed in the authority of priests. The written word was sacred, whether it appeared in a prayer book or on a medicine bottle. There was no room for suspicion. They trusted not because they were naive, but because the world taught them that obedience was virtue. When the label said safe, they did not question whose safety was being protected. The advertisements did more than sell medicine. They sold silence. They offered the illusion of control to women who had none. In a world where speaking about pain was indecent, the bottle became a private language. A few drops to calm the nerves replaced the need for explanation. The drug fit perfectly into the culture of suppression. It promised healing without conversation. The fewer women spoke about their pain, the more they consumed. The profit lay in the quiet. Doctors' endorsements added another layer of deceit. Some allowed their names to be printed on labels, lending authority they barely understood. Others sold the bottles in their own practices, earning profit from the dependence they created. There were even pamphlets distributed in churches, claiming that the medicine was a gift from God to soothe his children. The irony was unbearable. Faith, science, and commerce each played a part in the same performance of trust. In households across the empire, these advertisements hung on kitchen walls and slipped between the pages of family Bibles. The repetition turned them into background truth. Mothers quoted them casually, reassuring neighbours that the doctor recommends it, even when children fell ill or slept too long. The connection was never made. The idea that something so beautifully packaged could harm was unthinkable. Safety, after all, had a logo and a smiling nurse. The industry behind these labels grew rich on belief. Factories churned out thousands of bottles each week, their owners claiming they were serving the public good. The poor bought smaller doses. The rich bought elaborate versions wrapped in velvet. Everyone felt protected by the same illusion. The danger was democratic. It reached every hand that trusted a promise printed in ink. It was not deception shouted from the streets, but whispered from the paper. Polite and confident, the advertisements even survived a scandal. When stories of overdose appeared in the press, the companies responded with new campaigns. Beware of imitations. They warned, shifting blame to counterfeiters. The implication was that only their product was pure, only their poison was trustworthy. The cycle of tragedy and reassurance continued, wrapped in the same gentle tone that had started it. The truth, when it appeared, was always too late. The faith in these labels did not die quickly. Even as reformers began to question their claims, many women refused to let go. The bottle had become part of their identity, part of their daily rhythm. To doubt it would be to doubt their own judgment. And so, the words safe for women and children continued to appear, printed over poison until the very end of the century. The advertisements were not lies, they were lullabies. They sang of purity, protection, and peace, and no one wanted to wake from their tune. The ink on those labels did not just sell a product, it rewrote the meaning of trust. What began as marketing became belief, and belief became dependence. The empire's confidence in its medicine was unshakable, even as the evidence of death piled higher each year, and somewhere behind those smiling faces on the posters, the truth was waiting to be seen, quiet, patient, and lethal. It began as an ordinary absence. The bottle on the vanity was empty, the delivery delayed. For 2 days, the lady of the house had no laudanum, and the silence of the grand home began to tremble. Servants noticed her pacing through the halls, hands twisting a handkerchief until it tore, she muttered under her breath, her eyes darting as though the shadows themselves were whispering. No one dared to speak to her. The air in the house grew tight, the way air feels before a storm. On the third morning, the calm broke. What followed was recorded only in fragments, pieces of memory left behind in the servant's journal, words written in haste, ink smudged by fear. The entry described a change that seemed inhuman. The lady's face had gone pale, her lips dry, her voice unrecognizable. She screamed without sound, her body shaking as if gripped by something invisible. Servants ran to fetch help, but froze when they saw her turn on her children. They were small, sleeping in their nursery, unaware of the monster withdrawal had made of their mother. The attack was sudden and wordless, the act of a mind collapsing under its own hunger. It is horrifying to think that what began as a cure for pain ended as a ritual of madness, performed in a room that once smelled of milk and lavender. By the time help arrived, the scene was unthinkable. The lady sat on the floor, her gown stained, her breathing shallow. She stared at her own hands as though they no longer belonged to her. The doctor who examined her later wrote that she appeared detached from reality. His neat handwriting unable to capture the horror of the moment. Neighbours whispered about possession, about divine punishment, about hysteria, but none of them mentioned the empty bottle that had stood by her bedside for years. That small detail was quietly forgotten. The court never saw the case. Her husband, a man of influence, arranged for her to be declared ill rather than guilty. The diagnosis read temporary derangement due to feminine weakness. No one used the word withdrawal. No one spoke of addiction. If this happened today, it would be like excusing a crime of madness without asking what created the madness in the first place. Society preferred mystery to accountability. To admit that a respected woman had been undone by a legal drug would have meant questioning the system that sold it. The servants were left with their memories. One of them wrote in her journal that the lady's hands kept shaking even after she stopped screaming, as if her body still searched for the drug. The next day, new bottles of laudanum arrived from the apothecary. They were placed quietly in the cabinet, beside the Bible and the family portraits. The tragedy was sealed away as if it had never happened. Mourning was private, decorous, and brief. Guests came to the house weeks later, commenting on how peaceful it felt, unaware that her peace had been bought with storms. I find it unbearable to imagine how easily violence can grow from deprivation disguised as dependence. The lady was not a monster. She was the product of a system that treated emotion as disease and poison as cure. Her mind did not simply break, it was dissolved over years of obedience and medication. When the drug was taken away, what was left was raw, uncontrolled, and desperate. The moment the mask fell, the world called her insane. Not realizing they had created her madness themselves, the newspapers never mentioned her name. Stories like hers were softened, rewritten, or erased. The public preferred tales of redemption, not decay. Addiction in men could be called moral weakness. In women, it became an invisible illness no one dared define. The empire protected its illusions, keeping horror confined within the walls of respectable houses. Those who lived through it were told to forget. Forget the screams, the broken furniture, the small bodies. Forget that the cause was sold legally, prescribed kindly, praised endlessly. Her husband left the country soon after. He told friends she had gone to a sanatorium to recover her nerves. In truth, she was confined in a private wing of their estate, tended by nurses who gave her the same medicine that had destroyed her. Each day, she drank the drug that made her forget what she had done. Forgetting was the treatment. Ignorance, the cure. The children's names were never spoken again. The servants stayed on, though none of them slept well after that. They said that at night, the house felt restless, as if the walls themselves remembered. In the nursery, the toys were never removed. Dust gathered, light dimmed, and time itself seemed to slow. The lady lived on for years, walking through those rooms like a ghost, polite, composed, and utterly detached. Visitors described her as graceful, never knowing the price of her calm. The empire called her a patient, not a murderer. Oh, yeah. It was easier that way. The tragedy of that house was not unique. Many women faced the same descent, though theirs ended quietly, put behind locked doors or in lonely rooms. What made this story different was only its visibility. The brief moment when madness broke through the surface of civility. It revealed how thin the layer of refinement truly was, how fragile the idea of feminine composure. Laudanum did not just dull their senses, it erased their humanity until nothing remained but the shell society approved of. The murder of her children was not the act of evil, but the echo of dependence, the final scream of a mind that had been silenced too long. The empire forgave her, because to blame her would mean blaming itself. It was easier to call her mad than to admit she had been poisoned by obedience. Her story ended not with justice, but with a new bottle placed by her bedside. The servants' journal stopped after that week, their final lines written in trembling ink, and somewhere in those pages, the truth still breathes quietly, waiting for someone brave enough to read it aloud. They called them rest homes, retreats, and private hospitals for ladies of refinement. The advertisements described them as havens of calm, where gentle hands and modern medicine could restore a woman's health and spirit. But behind the iron gates and polished facades, These places were nothing like the sanctuaries they promised. The carriages that stopped at their entrances carried women who trembled, cried, or simply stared into nothing. Most had been sent there not because they were mad, but because their families no longer knew what else to do. Laudanum withdrawal had turned them restless, sleepless, unpredictable, and that made them an inconvenience. The cure, as always, was separation. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and despair. The walls were white, but not clean. They only reflected the emptiness of the rooms. Women lay in long rows of narrow beds, dressed in identical cotton gowns. Some muttered softly, others sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the light that filtered weakly through barred windows. Nurses moved quietly among them, carrying trays of medicine and spoons of the same drug that had caused the illness. It was a cycle disguised as care. It is almost comical, in a cruel way, that the Empire's cure for addiction was more of the same poison, only administered with better manners. There was no treatment, only containment, no healing, only control. The doctors walked through the wards with calm authority, noting symptoms that never changed. They wrote about female nervous collapse and temporary mania, as though these women were curiosities in a living museum of misery. To them, every trembling hand, every outburst, every cry for help confirmed the diagnosis. Few of them saw the connection between the illness and the bottles stacked in their own offices. If we compare it to today, it would be like sending someone addicted to sleeping pills to a clinic where the first prescription is more of the same. The absurdity of it would be almost funny, if not for the screams that filled those hallways at night. The patients arrived from every corner of society. Some were aristocrats who had once hosted glittering dinners. Others were wives of merchants or teachers. The only thing they shared was their silence. Families preferred to call their absence a rest cure or a trip to the countryside. The truth was never spoken. To admit addiction was to confess shame, so the women were hidden away, locked behind polite euphemisms. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. Many never left. The institutions kept their ledgers clean by marking deaths as natural exhaustion or decline of the nerves. No one outside ever asked for proof. I find it unbearable to think about how easily compassion was replaced with confinement. The idea of a woman being left to fade quietly in a bed, her mind fogged with drugs, her body wasting away, was accepted as medical care. Visitors came once, maybe twice, bringing flowers that wilted before the next visit. The patients themselves stopped asking when they would go home. They learned the rhythm of sedation, the sound of footsteps in the hall, the brief kindness of a nurse's voice before another spoonful of forgetfulness. Oblivion became routine. The nights were the worst. Without enough laudanum to keep the body calm, the mind broke apart. Some women screamed until their voices vanished. Others clawed at the walls or tore at their gowns. The nurses restrained them, calling it protection. When the drug returned to their veins, the quiet returned too, and the doctors wrote that progress had been made. In truth, every dose was a rehearsal for death. The patients no longer dreamed, they drifted. Each morning was another beginning of the same endless end. There were exceptions, women who resisted, who begged to stop taking the medicine. They were labelled uncooperative and tied to their beds. Their resistance was proof, in the doctor's eyes, that the illness still lived inside them. The hospital records praised their gradual improvement as their bodies weakened beyond recovery. Their deaths were never seen as a tragedy, only as relief. The Empire's medical system functioned like its factories, efficient, mechanical, and without conscience. In the wealthier hospitals, where the windows had lace curtains and the nurses wore polished shoes, the cruelty was simply hidden under better fabric. Patients were allowed books, but most could no longer read. They were given tea served in fine china, though their hands shook too much to hold the cup. The pretense of gentility made the suffering worse. Every kindness was a reminder that their lives were no longer their own. They had become the quiet scenery of a moral lesson no one dared to name. Some women were abandoned entirely. Their families stopped paying fees, and the institutions kept them until they died. The bodies were buried in small plots behind the buildings, without markers or prayers. The ledgers recorded only initials, dates, and vague causes: delirium, collapse, heart failure, or earlier. No one came to claim them. Their names disappeared. Their stories dissolved into the silence of the wards. For the Empire, it was a simple equation: one less hysterical woman, one more success. By the late century, reformers began to visit these places, horrified by what they found. They wrote reports describing the patients as living corpses, their lives drained by years of sedation. Their words caused brief outrage, then faded under the weight of habit. The world preferred to forget. The hospitals remained open, rebranded as sanatoriums. Their promise unchanged: rest, recovery, refinement. The only difference was the vocabulary. These institutions were not hospitals but mirrors, reflecting the cruelty hidden behind the Empire's civility. Each woman inside was a reminder of what happened when obedience became survival. The same drug that kept her calm at home now kept her silent in captivity. The cure was indistinguishable from the disease. The Empire called them sanctuaries for women. Yet behind the locked doors lay something far darker. As more patients vanished into those spotless corridors, the illusion of compassion began to decay from within. It often began with good intentions. A wife, admired for her grace and patience, followed her doctor's advice to take a few drops of laudanum before bed. It helped her sleep after long days filled with duties she never chose. Tending to the household, teaching the children, waiting for a husband who spent his nights elsewhere. The medicine worked. She slept soundly, woke refreshed, and thanked the doctor for his wisdom. There was no reason to suspect danger. The bottle was small, the liquid golden, the label reassuring. Each drop felt like kindness distilled. For a time, it was. Weeks passed, and the comfort began to fade. The same few drops no longer brought sleep. Rest turned shallow, dreams restless. She added another spoonful, then another, soon. The boundary between night and day began to blur. The calm that once felt like relief became something she had to chase. It is tragically ironic that the medicine designed to restore control was the very thing that unraveled it. Her hands trembled in the mornings. Her eyes lost focus in conversation. Yet no one saw sickness, only fatigue. A tired wife was ordinary. A silent one was ideal. As her tolerance grew, the drug rewrote her habits. She dosed earlier each evening. Then during the afternoon, when visitors came, she smiled faintly, her words measured and slow. Her husband praised her composure, proud of her serenity. The children learned not to disturb her when she rested, which was most of the time. The servants knew to refill the glass before she asked. Dependence settled over the household like a veil, soft and invisible. If we compare it to today, it would be like applauding someone for their calmness, while ignoring that their calm came from the bottle in their hand. The Empire did not see addiction as illness. It saw it as virtue perfected. Then came the nights when no amount of laudanum brought rest. Her body was too accustomed, her nerves too hollow. She lay awake, staring into the darkness, her heart pounding as if trying to escape. The quiet that once comforted her now felt suffocating. When she finally drifted into sleep, it came with visions, faces in the walls, whispers behind the door, shadows that moved without cause. The doctors called them nervous hallucinations, never mentioning the drug that caused them. Her husband called another physician, who prescribed a stronger dose. I find it unbearably sad how easily the descent could go unnoticed. Every stage looked like ordinary womanhood fatigue, fainting, forgetfulness. No one questioned the cause because the symptoms fit the expectations. Women were meant to be fragile. Fragility was proof of femininity. When her speech became disjointed, they said she was tired. When she forgot her own reflection, they said her mind was delicate. When she began to scream at invisible things, they finally said she was ill. The decision to send her away was made at breakfast. Her husband discussed it with the doctor over the tea, their voices calm, reasonable. She sat beside them, nodding faintly, barely aware that they were speaking of her. The plan was simple rest and treatment at a reputable hospital. The same phrases had been spoken about hundreds of women before her. Her belongings were packed neatly. She was told she would return soon, though no one truly believed it. The carriage came before noon. The children watched through the window as she was led inside, too drowsy to protest. In the hospital, her decline accelerated. Deprived of her usual dosage, her body convulsed with need. The doctors observed her shaking and called it hysteria. They recorded her symptoms with precision but never named the cause. When she cried, they increased the dose. When she grew sedent, they praised her recovery. Days turned into months. She no longer recognized the faces around her. Her world had shrunk to the size of her bed and the small spoon that ruled her existence. There were moments of clarity, brief and cruel. In those rare hours, she saw herself clearly. Once a wife, now a patient, her life reduced to routine. The mirror beside her bed reflected a stranger eyes sunken, lips pale, expression blank. She wondered when she had stopped being a person and become a case. The nurses treated her gently but distantly, and to them she was one of many. A success would mean she slept quietly, a failure meant she screamed. Either way, the record book stayed balanced. At home, her husband continued to receive polite updates. The doctor assured him she was improving, though the meaning of that word had changed. Improvement meant compliance, stillness, the absence of trouble. No one asked whether she could think, or feel, or remember. The woman who had once run a household now existed only as proof of treatment. Her letters home, if she wrote any, were short and polite. "I am resting," she wrote. "The doctors are kind." She signed them with trembling hands that no longer believed in words. When she died, the notice in the newspaper was brief. After a long illness, Lady X passed peacefully at a private institution. There was no mention of laudanum, no hint of madness. Her name was followed by phrases of dignity: devoted wife, gentle soul, beloved mother. The Empire mourned her as it had mourned many like her, quietly and without reflection. Her story was not unique. It was the ordinary path of a respectable woman who followed every rule, obeyed every instruction, and disappeared exactly as society expected her to. The journey from wife to patient was not a fall from grace, but a slow surrender disguised as care. Laudanum was the bridge that carried her from the illusion of control to the certainty of oblivion. Her calm was admired until it became silence, and by then it was too late. The Empire called her tragedy unfortunate, yet behind that polite grief lay a truth no one dared to face. For every woman sent to the hospital, another stood at home, holding her own bottle, tracing the same invisible path toward the same quiet end. Some husbands learned too quickly that the small amber bottle could do more than soothe. It could control in households where respect had turned to resentment. Laudanum became a quiet weapon. A spoonful slipped into evening tea, a few drops in a glass of wine, and the rest took care of itself. The wife would grow calm, obedient, and compliant. Her anger softened. Her opinions faded. Her body moved more slowly, and her voice no longer carried across the room. What began as a medical routine transformed into a form of captivity so gentle that no one called it cruelty. The house remained peaceful, and the husband was praised for his patience. It is disturbingly ironic that a society so obsessed with morality had no trouble applauding men who kept their wives docile through poison. The control was invisible. A husband who maintained his wife's health was considered attentive, even loving. When she grew too weak to manage the home, he hired help. When she forgot conversations, he comforted her. When she cried without reason, he told others she was fragile. Each act of supposed care deepened her dependence. The more she relied on him, the more he gained property, reputation, and obedience, secured not by violence but by chemistry. If something like this existed today, it would be like using a prescription bottle as a wedding ring. binding someone through sedation instead of love. The empire, ever proud of its progress, could not see that its refinement had turned into refined cruelty. The wives themselves rarely suspected betrayal. They trusted the hands that poured their drinks, the voice that told them to rest. When confusion came, they blamed their own weakness. The men had created the perfect illusion care as control, affection as anesthesia. Guests visiting these homes saw only calm. The women sat gracefully, eyes half-lidded, hands folded neatly in their laps. Their words were soft, their movements slow, their thoughts unreachable. They looked serene, and serenity was the highest compliment a woman could receive. No one noticed that serenity had been forced upon them. I find it unbearable to imagine how quiet those dinners must have been. The clink of silver, the faint scent of laudanum, the polite conversation that floated over the truth. The husband smiled. The guests admired his wife's composure, and beneath the table her hand trembled. The illusion was perfect because it was shared. Everyone preferred not to see. The servants, who refilled the glasses, knew but could not speak. The children, who watched their mother drift through the house like a shadow, learned that silence was safety. Some men justified their actions as kindness. They said the drug calmed their wives' nerves, prevented arguments, and made the household easier. Others were more direct. They liked control. A docile wife could not question the accounts, the inheritance, or the affairs conducted quietly in private clubs. The law gave husbands full authority over their wives' property and person. Laudanum ensured that authority was never challenged. It was not uncommon for a woman's allowance to include her own poison, purchased by the man who claimed to protect her. It was not only the drug that enslaved them, it was the approval that surrounded its use. Doctors were complicit. When husbands requested prescriptions, few asked questions. For her nerves, they would say, and the doctor would nod. Medicine reinforced what society already believed women were too emotional to manage themselves. Each refill became a signature of power, inked in secrecy. If a woman protested, the doctor would suggest more rest, perhaps a higher dose. Her defiance was proof of illness. Her compliance, proof of recovery. The system fed itself with logic so circular it crushed everything inside it. In time, many wives stopped resisting altogether. They no longer questioned their blurred vision, their aching heads, their fading memory. The drug erased the discomfort of awareness. They lived half asleep, drifting from room to room, smiling when spoken to, forgetting what they once cared about. The husband's control no longer required effort. The habit maintained itself. Even when the women sensed something was wrong, their thoughts slipped away before they could act. Dependence had become a quiet kind of death, one that required no mourning. The neighbours, seeing her frailty, whispered sympathy for the husband. Such a burden, they said, to care for a wife so ill. Their pity was misplaced, but it protected him from suspicion. When the woman's condition worsened, when she forgot names or wandered at night, they called it a tragedy, not a crime. To them, her weakness confirmed what they already believed, that women could not be trusted with freedom. The husband's role as caretaker became a badge of honour. The empire built monuments to reason while blind to its most methodical cruelty. The pattern repeated endlessly. A woman would grow too dependent to function. Her husband, tired of her condition, would send her away to a sanatorium, the polite word for disappearance. There she would fade completely, leaving behind a house filled with polite sympathy and unspoken relief. Her belongings would be packed away, her name spoken softly, her presence replaced by a new order of calm. The husband would move on, dignified and unchallenged, another model citizen of an empire that mistook control for care. The husbands who laced their wives' drinks believed they were maintaining peace, but what they built was silence so deep it devoured every truth around it. The drug became their language, their law, their weapon, wrapped in the softness of domestic love. Every drop they poured was a reminder that obedience could be engineered. The empire celebrated the serenity of its households, unaware that those serene women were prisoners of their own dining rooms, And as the bottles emptied night after night, a darker question began to surface. What happens when the poison is gone, and silence is no longer enough to keep the peace? The city at night was a different kind of madness. The gas lamps flickered weakly over cobblestone streets, their glow bending through the fog, catching glimpses of figures that did not belong. Policemen on patrol began to report strange scenes, women wandering barefoot through the alleys, their hair undone, their nightgowns soaked from the rain. Some wept softly as they walked, others moved in silence, their faces blank, their eyes wide as if searching for something they had lost. They did not know where they were, they did not know their own names. When questioned, they stared as though the words themselves were foreign sounds. 'Tis grimly ironic that the Empire prided itself on order, yet its streets were filled with the silent chaos of women walking through their own oblivion. Most of these women were not insane, though that was the word written in the police reports. They were suffering from laudanum, deprivation, minds torn between sleep and wakefulness, trapped in the narrow space where dreams spill into reality. Without the drug, the body convulsed, the mind fractured. They walked as if chasing the comfort that once calmed them, searching for something they no longer remembered how to find. The officers who found them often did not understand. To them, it was simply indecency, another symptom of female hysteria. The solution was arrest, not help. If this happened today, it would be like finding someone collapsing from withdrawal and locking them away for disturbing the peace. The Empire treated suffering as spectacle, not sickness. At the stations, the women were catalogued like lost items. Name, age, residence, condition. Many could not answer the questions. Some were never identified at all. Their clothes were described in detail, their eyes noted as vacant, their hands as trembling. The records were clinical, detached, and cold. There were no mentions of bottles, no acknowledgement of medicine. The reports ended with short phrases like committed to asylum or released to family. What happened after that was rarely known. For many, there was no after. I find it deeply haunting to imagine the sound of their footsteps echoing through empty streets, a rhythm of despair that no one wanted to hear. The city slept while they wandered, its windows glowing faintly with warmth that was no longer theirs. In the newspapers, these incidents appeared in the margins. Woman found disoriented, suspected madness, no foul play. Readers glanced over the lines and forgot them by morning. There was no scandal, no outrage, just a quiet acceptance that such things happened. Madness, after all, was a familiar story when told about women. The truth was darker than the headlines suggested. These were not isolated tragedies, but the natural end of a system that had turned dependence into normalcy. When the drug was absent, the body revolted. Hallucinations took hold. Some women believed they were being followed. Others heard voices calling them into the streets. The fog and the gaslight turned their confusion into something almost spectral. To the city, they looked like ghosts drifting through its veins. To themselves, they were lost children searching for a door that no longer existed. In certain districts, it became common to see them near dawn, sitting by the river or crouched beside church steps. The constables called them sleepwalkers, a word that sounded poetic enough to hide the horror. They were escorted away quietly, their protests ignored, their shaking dismissed as lunacy. Some were returned to families who could no longer care for them. Others were sent directly to institutions, their names entered into ledgers that would outlive them. The Empire had found a way to make its losses invisible by labelling them mad. The conditions that led to these night wanderings were never discussed publicly. To admit that laudanum could destroy women of every class was to question the medical and moral foundations of the nation. Doctors preferred silence. They blamed emotion, not chemistry. Husbands avoided shame by claiming nervous illness. The police, who saw the truth most directly, learned not to speak of it. Their duty was to maintain decorum, even when decorum meant pretending the madness of the streets did not exist. In some rare accounts, sympathetic officers wrote privately of their encounters. They described women clutching rosaries, whispering prayers through cracked lips, their fingers bleeding from the cold pull. One journal mentioned a woman found near the Thames, repeating the words, it's gone until she collapsed. Another spoke of a lady still in her pearls, wandering barefoot among beggars, her mind somewhere between dream and delirium. The entries ended abruptly, as if the writers themselves could not bear to continue. The next line always returned to routine, all quiet on patrol. When these women vanished, the city did not search for them. Their disappearances blended into the noise of industrial life. Another statistic, another absence. Families must sometimes place small notices in the papers, describing a lady gone missing, last seen unwell. Few were ever found. Some may have drowned, others been buried under false names in pauper graves. A few perhaps lived on, wandering endlessly, half awake, half asleep. They were the forgotten casualties of a medicine that promised rest and delivered ruin. As the century turned, reformers tried to expose the pattern. They collected testimonies, police notes, and hospital records, yet even they could not grasp the scale. For every name written down, dozens were lost. The empire's progress was measured in steel and smoke, not in the quiet suffering of its women. To acknowledge their fate would have been to admit that civilization itself was built on a lie. The sight of women drifting through the fog became one of the century's most tragic symbols. Elegance undone, obedience devoured by hunger for the drug that enslaved them. The streets swallowed them without a sound, and society called it madness. Their stories ended not with a scream, but with a whisper that no one chose to hear. The city's lamps kept burning, indifferent to their passing, while behind the windows others reached for their own bottles. Somewhere in that endless night, the line between sleepwalking and survival began to fade completely. The house had been filled with laughter that morning, flowers arranged, ribbons tied, servants rushing from room to room with the nervous joy of preparation. By evening, the music faded into whispers, and candles burned too low. The bride, barely 17, sat in her new gown of cream silk, hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mother had pressed a small glass into her hand, just a few drops, she said, to calm the nerves, to ease the trembling before the wedding night. Laudanum was a friend to every household, harmless in small amounts, comforting as sleep. No one thought twice. The doctor had once prescribed it for menstrual pain. Why not for fear? The bride drank obediently, trusting the ritual that had soothed her mother and her mother's mother before her. It is hard to imagine a more tragic irony. A girl taking poison as part of her passage into womanhood. The wedding ended as tradition demanded, vows exchanged, champagne poured, congratulations spoken with polished smiles, guests left late, their laughter echoing faintly down the marble steps. Behind the closed doors of the bridal suite, silence grew heavy. The young husband found his wife asleep, her breathing shallow, her skin unnaturally pale. He thought she was only tired. Hours passed. When dawn came, her body was cold. The servant said she looked peaceful, almost holy, like a painting of the Virgin in repose. But holiness was not what had taken her. It was habit, a few drops too many, a family tradition unmeasured, a culture that confused calm with safety. The empire had built its gentility on faith in medicine, and the medicine had claimed another life. The doctor arrived mid-morning. He examined her, wrote a short note, and folded it neatly into his case. A heart too delicate, he said. She died of fright. It was easier to say that than to speak the word laudanum. No one wanted a scandal. The newspapers would not mention it. The family would not allow it. The bottle was removed quietly, placed in a drawer, never to be seen again. If this happened now, it would be like handing a bride a glass of wine laced with sedatives, telling her it was love's kindness, then calling her death romantic. The absurdity would cause outrage today. But in those drawing rooms, it was decorum. I can almost feel the suffocating stillness of that room, the scent of roses already fading, the dress untouched, the air thick with perfume and regret. The husband sat beside her, numb, his face pale as the sheets. Outside, the bells of the church rang for morning mass, their echoes colliding with the hush of the house. Servants moved quietly, avoiding eye contact, already aware of the silence that would follow. In the official records, the cause was written as sudden failure of the heart, no mention of the amber bottle. No mention of the mother's trembling hand that had poured it. The funeral took place 3 days later. The same flowers from the wedding were rearranged into wreaths. The same guests came, now dressed in black, whispering about fate. The bride's name was spoken softly, as if too much volume might disturb her eternal rest. Her mother fainted twice. Her father stared straight ahead, his face a mask of stone. The priest spoke of purity, of peace, of divine will. No one spoke of the drug. To them, it was unthinkable that something so common, so trusted, could be blamed for death. They would rather believe in God's mystery than in human carelessness. At night, after the mourners left, the husband walked the empty halls, stopping at the door of the bridal chamber. The bed was still made, the veil still draped over the chair. He sat in the dark, listening to the creak of the house. In his mind, he heard her voice, soft and distant, asking if she looked nervous, if she seemed enough like a wife. He had said yes. She had smiled and reached for the bottle. That was the last moment of life in her eyes. And the next morning, the papers printed an obituary filled with grace and sponsors a young life, taken too soon. No one dared ask why. The servants buried their own grief in work. One of them, a maid named Ellen, wrote in her journal that the house had never felt clean again. She described the faint smell of medicine lingering in the air. Even after the room was scrubbed, the scent never left. Guests who visited in later years said the house seemed quieter than most, as if sound itself refused to settle there. The bride became a ghost of memory, spoken of only in passing. The story of her death was passed down as a warning, though no one changed their habits. The next generation would do the same, offer the same glass, whisper the same words, and repeat the same mistake. The tragedy was not unique. Dozens of similar cases were recorded across the empire. Though few reached the public, young women died before their lives began. Their deaths wrapped in euphemism, exhaustion, shock, heart failure. The cause was always invisible. Because it was everywhere. Laudanum had become part of the ceremony of life, birth, marriage, and death. All touched by its calm, the drug was the quiet witness to every vow and every ending. The empire prided itself on civility, but its refinement was a thin disguise for fear, fear of emotion, fear of imperfection, fear of the noise of living. To calm those fears, it dosed its women with poison and called it virtue. There was comfort in stillness, even if that stillness was death. The perfection of the scene mattered more than the truth of what caused it. A peaceful corpse was preferable to a restless heart. The bride's death was not an accident. It was the perfect image of what society demanded: beauty, silence, and surrender. The bottle on her dressing table was as much a symbol of marriage as the ring on her finger. She had fulfilled her role completely, even in dying. The wedding bells that once promised happiness became an echo of mourning that no one dared interpret, and somewhere, in another house, another mother poured another glass, believing the same gentle lie that had already taken her daughter's life. After childbirth, the nights were long and unbroken. The cries of newborns echoed through narrow rooms, and the exhaustion of mothers was treated not with rest, but with medicine. Doctors prescribed laudanum as a blessing, a few drops to calm the nerves, to stop the trembling, to help them sleep between feedings. The bottle became a fixture on every bedside table, its amber glow catching the light of oil lamps, as if it held something gentle inside. The mothers trusted it because everyone did. It was respectably sold, even encouraged by physicians who spoke of it as relief for delicate constitutions. What they did not say was that the comfort came at a cost that would soon reach even the smallest body in the room. It is painfully absurd that an empire so proud of its science could not see the cruelty in dosing its infants before they could even speak. The mothers did not mean harm. They were weary, aching, torn between care and collapse. When the drug dulled their senses, it also dulled their worries. The baby's cries faded, the world grew quiet, and for a few precious hours, peace returned. They held their infants close, breathing evenly, unaware that every drop of milk carried traces of the same poison. The babies fed without protest, then slept too deeply, their lips pale, their limbs limp against the warmth of their mother's skin. To onlookers, it looked serene, a perfect image of motherly devotion. The calm was admired, photographed, and written about. No one questioned the stillness. If this happened today, it would be like watching a mother soothe her child with a sedative and calling it tenderness. The horror lay in the gentleness. I find it unbearable to imagine that silence. The room filled with two bodies at rest, one resting from exhaustion, the other from life itself. There was no sign of struggle, no cry, no panic. The poison worked quietly, like the society that allowed it. In some homes, the babies began to feed less often, their eyelids stayed closed longer, and their breathing turned shallow. Doctors called it weakness, a natural fragility. They recommended more laudanum for the mother. Believing that calmness would bring recovery, the cycle repeated, each night a little quieter than the last. In letters written by midwives of the time, there were whispers of unease. Some noticed that infants of laudanum-using mothers were smaller, slower to cry and harder to wake, but their observations carried little weight. Women were told that a calm baby was a blessing, proof of good mothering. The restless ones, they said, belonged to careless mothers, and so the still ones were praised. The empire, ever fearful of noise, mistook lethargy for virtue. Every sleeping child was another mark of success, another sign that order reigned even within the cradle. There were advertisements, too, posters showing smiling women holding chubby babies, bottles of safe relief drawn in elegant cursive beside them. The slogans promised peace, convenience, and health. The fine print was unreadable or simply absent. Laudanum appeared under many names: infant syrups, teething drops, soothing cordials. The mothers who bought them were often desperate, juggling poverty, grief, and hunger. They did not see themselves as drug users. They saw themselves as caretakers. The bottle gave them the illusion of control in a life that allowed so little of it. In poorer districts, the effects were even more devastating. The mothers there worked long hours, returning home with aching limbs and little food. Laudanum was cheaper than rest, cheaper than care. A single bottle could stretch through weeks of sleepless nights. The infants, too weak to resist, became quiet companions in a household always on the edge of collapse. When one died, neighbours whispered condolences and spoke of God's will. The doctor, if he came at all, wrote failure to thrive on the certificate. No one asked about the medicine. No one wanted to. In the homes of the wealthy, the tragedy wore silk. Ladies with pale faces and trembling hands took laudanum as fashionably as perfume. When their babies weakened, they called specialists who prescribed more of the same. Nurses were instructed to ensure both mother and child received sufficient rest. Behind lace curtains, the same poison moved from body to body, crossing class and comfort alike. The empire's devotion to calm spared no one. From the tenement to the manor, sleep had become the most dangerous luxury a woman could buy. The newspapers occasionally mentioned mysterious infant deaths, phrases like unexpected passing or frail constitution. One medical journal dared to suggest that narcotic use among nursing mothers was to blame. The author was ridiculed for exaggeration. His warnings were dismissed as overly sentimental. Public denial was easier than the truth. To admit guilt would mean questioning not only medicine but motherhood itself. The silence was self-preservation disguised as propriety. In time, entire generations would be touched by the habit. Some children survived, but they grew weak, their bodies thin, their minds slow to form. The pattern was invisible, scattered through thousands of homes, each carrying the same hidden bottle. It was not an epidemic in the eyes of the empire, it was simply life. The doctors continued to write prescriptions, the mothers continued to trust them, the deaths continued quietly, politely, almost gracefully. The saddest part was how love itself became the instrument of harm. These women did not neglect their children, they cherished them, they kissed their foreheads, whispered lullabies, and gave them what they believed was comfort. The poison was passed through devotion, through the very bond that should have saved them. Every act of care became an unknowing betrayal. The empire turned its mothers into messengers of death, and it called the result peace in the nursery. The image of a mother nursing her child should have been sacred, but under the empire's medicine, it became the slowest form of suffocation. Each feeding was a mixture of tenderness and poison, the gentlest way to disappear. The bottle that promised sleep for one generation ensured silence for the next. When reformers finally began to question it, they found a truth too cruel for polite society to bear, that the very hands meant to nurture were unknowingly delivering death in drops, and somewhere, in another quiet room, another mother reached for the same comfort, believing that love could never kill. The candy looked innocent enough, small, round, and dusted with sugar that sparkled in the shop windows. Children pressed their noses to the glass, pointing at the colours, pleading for just one piece. The mothers smiled, buying a handful to keep their little ones quiet on the walk home. The wrappers were cheerful, the names playful, and the promise simple sweetness and calm. No one asked what was inside. The label said soothing lozenges or infant comfort drops, and that was enough. Inside those bright wrappers, however, lay something far darker. The candies were laced with morphine and opium, sweetened poison crafted for small tongues. It is terrifyingly absurd that an empire capable of building railways across continents could not stop selling narcotics to children disguised as treats. Factories produced them in bulk, mixing syrup with powdered opium, pressing them into moulds shaped like hearts and stars. The flavour masked the bitterness, leaving only a faint trace that made the tongue tingle pleasantly. Parents believed the candies soothed teething pain, settled upset stomachs, and quieted tantrums. For the poor, they were a miracle, cheap, easy, and available in every shop. Even doctors endorsed them, claiming that a bit of morphine did less harm than a night of crying. The empire preferred silence to discomfort, calm to truth. If this happened today, it would be like handing children candy filled with tranquilizers and calling it good parenting. The comparison feels impossible. Yet it was once entirely normal. I find it unbearable to picture those tiny hands clutching the candies, their smiles wide, their mothers relieved, unaware that each sweet carried a fragment of their child's undoing. Addiction began in innocence. The more the children ate, the more they needed. At first, the change was subtle long naps, quiet behaviour, a new stillness mistaken for obedience. Then came the trembling, the glassy eyes, the pale skin, and their bodies weakened, their minds clouded, their laughter dulled. Some forgot how to play altogether. The sweets that once brought peace began to steal everything else. In the slums, the candies became a kind of currency. Shopkeepers sold them by the handful to mothers who couldn't afford milk. Children sucked them instead of eating dinner. The sugar gave brief energy. The drug dulled hunger, and the cycle continued. When some of the children died, their deaths were written off as malnutrition or fever. No one saw the connection, or perhaps no one wanted to. The comfort of ignorance was easier to swallow than the bitterness of truth. The merchants knew, of course, but profit had its own morality. The candy sold quickly, and demand never faltered. In middle-class homes, the addiction took a quieter form. Well-dressed children with ribbons in their hair were given soothing drops after lessons. a reward for good behaviour. They grew polite, sleepy, and forgetful. Teachers praised their calmness. Mothers boasted about their well-behaved little angels, never realising that their children's stillness came not from discipline but dependence. As they aged, many suffered chronic fatigue, fainting spells, or strange fits of rage. The doctors called it nervous collapse. They prescribed more medicine. Factories loved the deception. The marketing was genius candy that comforted, sweets that sold themselves. The production costs were low, and there were no regulations to follow. They printed angelic children on the labels, halos and ribbons drawn with care, promising purity. Behind the factory doors, workers stirred mixtures of opium and syrup in iron vats, pouring them into moulds until the air itself smelled faintly narcotic. The candies were stacked into barrels and shipped to every corner of the empire. What left the factory as sugar returned as grief. The addiction did not stop in childhood. Many of those children grew up unable to live without the drug. They sought stronger doses, turning from candy to laudanum, from innocence to oblivion. Society called them weak, ignoring the fact that their weakness had been sold to them before they learned to write their own names. The empire's markets were full of miracles that killed slowly. Every packet promised relief, every bite carried despair. Newspapers occasionally printed warnings, but they were buried between advertisements for soap and corsets. One editorial described unfortunate accidents among infants who consumed soothing lozenges without proper measure. It was written with such restraint that no one felt alarmed. A few reformers tried to campaign against the practice, but their voices were dismissed as hysteria, an irony too bitter to ignore. Given who had been accused of hysteria for generations, the empire's calm was too profitable to question. In some houses, the candies were replaced by syrups, easier to measure but equally deadly. Mothers spooned them carefully into their children's mouths, timing the doses with the clock on the mantel. The babies fell asleep quickly, and the house grew quiet. The mothers tidied the rooms, grateful for the stillness. It never crossed their minds that the silence was unnatural. In their eyes, they were doing everything right. The medicine said so, and the doctor said so. Everyone said so, until the day the child would not wake. The tragedy was collective, spread so evenly across the empire that it almost disappeared. When 1,000 homes suffer the same sorrow, it stops being a scandal and becomes culture. The empire prided itself on progress and refinement, yet beneath its polished surface lay rows of candy jars filled with death. The sweetness was deliberate, the danger accepted. To question it was to question everything about how they lived, how they raised their children, and how they defined care. There is something deeply unsettling about how easily the language of love can disguise cruelty. Parents gave candy not out of neglect but affection. They wanted to soothe, to comfort, to protect. The harm was invisible, and that invisibility made it permanent. The candies that filled the children's pockets were not just confections, they were the first lessons in dependency. Sugar-coated obedience taught from the cradle. The empire called it sweetness, but it was submission disguised as flavour. Each piece melted on the tongue like a promise that never had to be kept. The children who once laughed in the markets became shadows of calm, their joy exchanged for silence. As the candy trade flourished, few realised that addiction had found its most perfect disguise. Somewhere, in a factory that smelled faintly of sugar, new moulds were being filled, waiting to feed the next generation their first taste of ruin. They said she went mad, that something inside her mind simply broke. The neighbours heard the screams first, the crash of glass, the smell of smoke that followed. By the time anyone reached her, the fire had already consumed most of the room. What they found was a body curled near the window, surrounded by shards of mirror and blackened lace. The reports called it hysteria. The newspapers wrote of a troubled young woman overcome by delusion. No one mentioned the days she had spent without her medicine, the bottle that had once kept her calm now empty beside her bed. It is grimly ironic that the empire described such deaths as weakness, when it was their idea of treatment that had built the madness in the first place. She had been a quiet girl once, the kind others described as gentle. Her family said she was fragile, a little too sensitive, Ian easily tired. Laudanum had been prescribed when she was 15, boss. First for sleeplessness, then for sadness, then for nothing at all. The habit grew invisibly, as it always did. A few drops in tea, a teaspoon before bed, years passed, and her body learned to need it more than food. When the drug ran out, the calm turned to terror. She began to hear scratching inside her head, a faint rustling that grew louder each night. Her reflection became a stranger, her shadow an intruder. The hallucinations came not from madness, but from absence. The body's rebellion against the substance it had come to depend on. If this happened today, it would be like calling an overdose victim unstable while ignoring the hands that sold her the pills. The logic of blame has changed little. I find it unbearable to picture the moment she faced that mirror, seeing not herself but something moving behind the glass. The noise she imagined. A mouse, she said once, crawling inside her skull, was the mind's final cry for relief. She smashed the mirror, desperate to make the sound stop. In that panic, her hands found the lamp. The oil spilled. Fire followed quickly, as if drawn to the suffering. The neighbours said it was an accident, but the investigators disagreed. They wrote that she had set the blaze herself, driven by female instability. The coroner's notes recorded her cause of death as self-inflicted due to nervous weakness. No mention of withdrawal, no trace of accountability. Before the fire, she had begged her doctor for more laudanum. He refused, saying she had grown too dependent, that discipline was the only cure. Her family agreed. They locked the cabinet, thinking it an act of mercy. Without the drug, she trembled violently, her skin clammy, her breath shallow. She screamed of insects crawling under her scowl, her faces behind the wallpaper. The servants tried to comfort her, but were told not to listen, not to encourage the hysteria. By the third night, the sound of her cries was unbearable. The next day, she was gone. In the days after her death, her mother spoke softly of misfortune. The father paid for a modest funeral, closed the shutters, and told the servants to burn her belongings. No one mentioned the empty bottles, the doctor's visits, or the small locked drawer in her vanity. The story that spread through the neighbourhood was one of frail femininity destroyed by emotion. It was easier that way. Madness. They could accept. Addiction. They could not. The empire needed its illusions, and so it called her tragedy a moral lesson instead of a warning. The newspapers wrote a few sentences. A young lady of delicate health succumbed to nervous excitement, resulting in an unfortunate accident. Beneath the polite phrasing lay an entire life of slow poisoning. The journalist who wrote the line never asked how many others had suffered the same fate. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. These incidents had become part of the city's background noise, too common to shock, too silent to stop. In the hospitals, doctors discussed her case with detached curiosity. Some argued that women were more prone to self-destruction, their passions too volatile to contain. Others suggested that her mind had been weakened by idleness. None mentioned the drug. To do so would be to indict the very profession that profited from it. The reports written afterwards spoke of morality, discipline, and the dangers of emotional excess. Her name appeared in medical journals as an example of female instability, not as a victim of chemical bondage. Among the servants, whispers told a truer story. They remembered the way she used to sing quietly in the mornings, her voice light as breath. They remembered how, in the final days, she spoke to the walls, how her hands shook so badly she could not hold a cup. One maid said she saw her standing before the mirror hours before the fire, whispering, "Make it stop." The maid was dismissed the next day. Her words never reached the authorities. There was no public outrage, no call for reform. Her death was one among thousands, recorded politely, buried quickly. The empire continued to praise its order and civility, never admitting that its women were burning from within. For every girl who died by fire, There were dozens more wasting slowly in their beds, their bodies eaten away by dependence. The calm faces in portraits, the stillness in family photographs. All of it was the same quiet illusion. The cost of peace was silence, and silence was paid in lives. Years later, the house was rebuilt, the walls repainted, the mirrors replaced. The new owners never knew what had happened there, but locals said that sometimes, at dusk, a faint smell of smoke drifted from the upper windows, even on still nights. They called it superstition. The truth was simpler memory clings hardest to what people try hardest to forget. The girl's death was written as weakness, yet it was the Empire's strength that killed her, the strength of denial, of decorum, of medicine turned to weaponry. The fire did not consume her madness, it consumed the lie that madness was hers alone. Her ashes were scattered quietly into the city's air, joining countless others who burned without ever being seen. Somewhere, behind another locked door, another woman trembled, another bottle emptied, and the cycle prepared to begin again. At first, no one noticed when the invitations went unanswered. A headache, they said, or simple fatigue. The hostess sent polite regrets, promising to attend the next gathering, and her absence was quickly forgiven, but the excuses multiplied. She stopped appearing at dinners, then at church, then even at the window where she once watched the carriages pass. Neighbours whispered that she was delicate, the polite word for fading. The truth was quieter and far more common. She had begun to slip into the fog of laudanum. 1 teaspoon at a time. It is almost comical, in the cruelest sense, that Victorian society admired a woman's frailty so much that it could not tell the difference between elegance and decay. Her decline followed a pattern as predictable as the seasons. The medicine began as rest, a drop before bed, prescribed by the family doctor for sleeplessness. It worked beautifully at first. She woke refreshed, calm and composed. But sleep became shorter, and the need for the drug grew longer. She started taking it in the afternoon, then before meals, then whenever the silence of the house became too loud or the days blurred, the tea cooled in its cup, the letters went unanswered, and the fire burned low in the grate. Her world shrank to the size of the room she no longer left. If we saw it today, it would look like a life lived entirely online, where the world outside fades into irrelevance while the addiction inside becomes the only comfort. I find it haunting how easily the line between rest and ruin dissolved for these women, as if society itself conspired to make their withdrawal invisible. Their absence caused no scandal, no suspicion. It was normal for women to retreat, to be quiet, to disappear behind lace curtains. The Empire praised discretion, and so it never asked why. Husbands explained their wives' seclusion as sensitivity, friends sent flowers and forgot them within a week. What began as self-care ended as self-erasure. The drug did not steal them violently, it stole them gently, through years of fading interest and soft decline. Inside their rooms, time stopped meaning anything. The curtains remained drawn even on clear mornings. Books gathered dust on the bedside table. Sometimes, the maids heard laughter behind the door, thin, disconnected, as though the sound belonged to someone else. The women slept for hours, sometimes days, their bodies limp, their minds hovering in the grey space between waking and oblivion. The house adjusted around them. Meals were sent upstairs, errands were managed without them. Eventually, even the servants stopped knocking. To the outside world, they were still alive but socially dead. They ceased to exist as individuals and became household rumours, names spoken softly, always in the past tense. She used to host such lovely teas, people said, or she was quite the pianist. The word was carried the weight of their disappearance. Husbands continued their lives unbothered, their reputations intact. A wife confined to her bed was a manageable inconvenience, not a tragedy. Society preferred to preserve the image of marital stability rather than acknowledge its cost. When the symptoms worsened, Families called for doctors who prescribed more of the same. The women who mumbled incoherently were said to be overwrought. The ones who screamed were restrained. There were no cures, only quieting measures. By the time confusion turned to madness, it was too late to save them. The laudanum had rewired their bodies, their thoughts, their capacity to care. Their reflection in the mirror became unrecognizable. Yet no one else noticed. The empire was full of these rooms, one in every street, one in every family, a hidden hospital of the forgotten. In some rare cases, the wives' decline drew sympathy from the press. Newspapers printed small features about the melancholy affliction of delicate women, blaming modern life for overtaxing their nerves. The articles suggested rest, faith, and gentleness as remedies, never once naming the drug. It was always easier to speak in generalities, to reduce human suffering to moral weakness. The empire preferred to think its women simply too sensitive for reality, rather than victim of a substance prescribed by the very men who judged them. The quiet deaths began long before the final breath. Some women stopped speaking entirely, their voices swallowed by exhaustion. Others drifted into dementia, unable to recall their own children. When they finally died, the obituaries were graceful and cold. Phrases like peacefully at home or after a long illness. Their graves bore no hint of addiction, only polished words carved in stone. Beloved wife, devoted mother. The truth lay buried with them. For those who lingered, the years passed in slow erosion. The mind faded first, the body next, the memory last. Friends aged and moved on, children married, husbands remarried. The women remained, pale outlines against pillows, breathing quietly while the world continued without them. It was not madness that destroyed them. It was neglect disguised as care. They were the ghosts of their own lives, haunting the homes they once ruled. The empire's obsession with composure made their suffering invisible. To show pain was unseemly, to disappear was refined. Their decline was the perfect scandal because it required no witnesses. Behind every window where the curtain stayed drawn, another life was dissolving in slow, respectable silence. The drug was not just a medicine, it was an eraser, removing women from history one gentle dose at a time. Their vanishing was the empire's quietest epidemic, one it mistook for virtue. The women who vanished into their beds were not fragile, they were forgotten. Laudanum did not free them from pain, it freed everyone else from acknowledging it. The world outside continued to dance and dine, pretending not to see the empty seats left behind. Somewhere, in another house, another wife was pouring her evening dose, unaware that her own disappearance had already begun. In the narrow alleys where the air smelled of smoke and damp stone, the women who scrubbed floors and carried buckets also carried another hunger, one that could not be fed with bread. They had seen laudanum in the homes where they worked, sitting on polished nightstands beside silk handkerchiefs and gilt mirrors. The ladies of those houses sipped it delicately, a teaspoon at a time, while the maids changed their linens and emptied their basins. For the poor, that amber liquid shimmered like a dream. It promised rest, escape, and a few hours without pain. But dreams cost money, and money was the one thing they never had. It is cruelly ironic that the empire could afford compassion in bottles, yet reserved it only for those who needed it least. When the pain of exhaustion became unbearable, some of these women found their way to the back streets where imitation bottles were sold from under coats or through half-open doors. The liquid was cheaper, darker, and deadlier. It was laudanum in name only, a mixture of opium scraps, cheap gin, and whatever chemicals the seller could find. Still, they bought it. The first sip burned like fire. The warmth that followed was worth any risk. Their bodies loosened, their minds lifted, and for a brief while they could forget the endless repetition of washing, scrubbing, and obeying. If this happened today, it would be like workers trading meals for counterfeit pills that promised sleep but delivered poison. The logic of desperation never changes, only the packaging does. I find it unbearable to imagine the small triumph these women must have felt, clutching their bottle like salvation while knowing it might kill them before dawn. They were not chasing pleasure, they were chasing relief. Poverty gave them nothing but fatigue, and fatigue demanded mercy in any form. A few drops of the drug offered that mercy. The danger was an afterthought, the same way hunger is ignored until it kills. They shared doses among friends, passing the cork-stopper bottle like communion. For some, it was the first thing that made them feel alive. For others, it was the last thing they ever held. The market for counterfeit laudanum grew as fast as despair itself. Street chemists worked in basements lit by tallow candles, stirring together unknown powders and spirits. The mixtures varied wildly, some harmless, others instantly fatal. A single dose might leave a woman blind, or bleeding, or convulsing in the gutter. The police did not care. The bodies of poor women did not cause panic. They caused inconvenience. Reports of sudden female illness filled the records, and no one investigated further. In the Empire's eyes, they were too common to matter. In the textile mills and laundries, women whispered about the drug between shifts. Some had tried it once and never again. Others craved it daily. When the ache in their hands grew unbearable, when their backs bent from endless labour, they thought of that brief floating calm. They could not afford medicine, but they could sell an hour of their bodies to buy it. The transaction was simple, mechanical, and cruel. Men in the taverns knew this. They offered coins, sometimes even the bottle itself, in exchange for silence and submission. The women took the bargain because survival was not the same as choice. Addiction among the poor moved quickly because there was no disguise to soften it. The rich could fade quietly behind bedroom doors. The poor collapsed in the street. Their sickness was visible tremors, spasms, cries that startled passers-by. Yet their visibility brought no help, only judgment. The newspapers described them as fallen, not sick. The sermons warned against sin, not suffering. When the madness came, visions, screams, sudden violence, it was seen as proof of moral failure rather than chemical ruin. The Empire's moral code was as cheap and toxic as the drugs it ignored. The black market sellers understood their customers perfectly. They called the imitation laudanum comfort syrup, a name that mocked its victims even as it kept them coming back. They sold it in smaller bottles so the poor could afford it, marking each cork with a cross to suggest safety. Some women carried the bottle in their apron pocket, hidden from the overseers at work. Others kept it under their pillow, a secret worth more than the coins in their purse. When they ran out, withdrawal came fast and violent, sweats, shaking, the creeping terror that something was crawling beneath the skin. Many died within days, but others lingered, slipping gradually into confusion that no one could name. The streets of industrial towns became laboratories of suffering. Police records mention women found wandering half-naked, shouting nonsense, or collapsing in churchyards. Their eyes were wild, their mouths foaming from whatever was in the counterfeit mix. Doctors sometimes took pity, though most refused to treat them, claiming their cases were beyond reason. The few who were taken to hospitals rarely survived. Their deaths were written as dissolution or fever. The truth did not fit polite language. In rare moments of clarity, some of the women tried to stop. They prayed. They begged for work that would pay enough to eat instead of the dole. But the drug had already rewritten their bodies, and poverty had already erased their choices. Without it, they could not sleep. Without sleep, they could not work. The spiral tightened until it became life itself. There was no cure for poverty, and therefore none for addiction. The Empire kept both in perfect balance. Factories benefited from the silence. A worker who took laudanum did not argue, did not protest, did not strike. She simply worked until she could not. The system fed itself neatly. The same industrial expansion that produced wealth for the upper class created despair for the women who cleaned its machines. Laudanum was their only rebellion, a way to reclaim an hour of peace from lives that offered none. Yet even that rebellion was borrowed. sold to them drop by drop, until peace itself became a commodity they could never afford again. In the end, their names rarely appeared in records. They vanished into the cracks of the city, their deaths unmarked, except by brief mentions in the ledgers of workhouses or asylums. Their absence made no noise, but their hunger remained, inherited by the next generation. The factories kept humming, the markets kept selling, and the empire kept congratulating itself on order. For the working women, laudanum was not luxury but survival, a counterfeit comfort that replaced hunger with hallucination. The empire did not have to chain them. It only had to sell them dreams in bottles. Their pain was profitable, their ruin invisible. When reformers finally looked down from their polished offices, they saw not individuals but a blur of faces half asleep in the streets, in the shadow of the factories. Another girl was handing over her last coin, believing the same lie that every woman before her had believed, that relief was the same as freedom. The house had once been quiet, filled with the ordinary sounds of a respectable family, meals served on time, footsteps on polished floors, the hum of daily routine. Then came the whispers at night, the soft thud of movement in the daughter's room, and the low voice murmuring to someone who wasn't there. At first, they thought it was nerves, perhaps exhaustion. The doctor said a little more laudanum would calm her, that too much thinking could unsettle a young woman's mind, so they gave her the medicine faithfully, spoon after spoon, night after night, but the calm never came. Instead, her eyes grew distant, her voice turned strange, and the girl who had once laughed at the piano began to speak of shadows in the mirror, and unseen hands cutting her hair as she slept. It is a grim joke that an empire so proud of its order could not distinguish madness from the sickness it created for itself. The family tried to reason with her. They showed her the uncut hair, the untouched brush, the tidy room. She shook her head, whispering that the thief would return. At night, she refused to sleep, pacing the floor, clutching her braid in both hands as though defending it from invisible scissors. Her mother wept, her sisters prayed, and her father called the doctor again. The man examined her calmly, asked a few questions, and prescribed more of the same, larger doses, more frequently. The treatment that had begun the madness was now its only cure. If this happened today, it would be like treating a house fire by throwing more oil into the flames and calling it mercy. The logic was simple when a woman suffered. It was her body's fault, never the medicine's. I find it unbearable to picture that family sitting in the dim candlelight, watching their daughter unravel while still believing they were helping her. On the fourth night, her screams woke the entire house. They found her standing before the mirror, tearing at her hair, shouting that someone was inside it, laughing at her. The father held her as she thrashed, her strength shocking him. The decision to restrain her came not from cruelty, but from fear. He tied her wrists gently with the belt of his dressing gown, promising it would only be for a little while. By morning, she had bruises on her arms from the struggle, but the doctor praised the action as necessary. She must be kept from harming herself, he said, pouring another dose into her mouth as though it were grace. Days passed in a blur of sedation and panic. Sometimes she slept for hours, her breathing shallow, her face pale as linen. Other times, she woke in wild confusion, screaming at the walls or begging the shadows to leave her alone. The family took turns watching her. Though her father aged visibly under the strain, he began to drink the same medicine at night, claiming he needed it to rest after the chaos. The bottle that had destroyed one life now began to claim another. The cycle was complete, sealed inside a house that still looked perfect from the street. Visitors were told that the daughter had taken ill, that her nerves were fragile. The truth remained behind closed doors. Servants whispered of the noises at night, the scraping, the laughter, the sound of glass breaking. They said she talked to her reflection, asking it questions no one could understand. One maid swore she saw the girl smiling into the mirror as if listening to a secret. No one dared stay in the room for long. The house began to feel cursed, but it was not the curse of superstition. It was the curse of the price of pride. The doctors came and went, each leaving behind the same instructions: more rest, more medicine. They wrote their notes carefully, avoiding words like addiction or withdrawal. Instead, they used phrases like female disturbance and temporary derangement. The father paid each bill without complaint. His guilt was hidden under obedience to authority. The empire had trained its men to believe that medicine was infallible and emotion was weakness. The doctor's word was law, and law demanded compliance, even when compliance meant destruction. In moments of brief lucidity, the girl spoke softly to her mother. She said the mirror whispered her name, that it told her secrets about the other world. The mother tried to pray, but her faith faltered. She began to wonder if the devil truly lived in the house. The priest who visited offered blessings but little comfort. The mind is fragile, he said. It must be guided with discipline. He too suggested the medicine. It was the one cure everyone agreed upon, even as it hollowed her from within. The final weeks were a blur of restraint and confusion. The ropes became tighter as her fits grew stronger. Sometimes she laughed for hours. Other times she stared blankly at the ceiling. Her hair, once long and shining, began to fall out in clumps. The family blamed the illness, but it was the drug that had poisoned her blood, starved her blood, and stripped her mind. One morning, the father entered her room to find her silent. Her hand still bound, her eyes fixed on the mirror. She no longer spoke of the shadow inside it. Perhaps it had finally taken her. The death certificate listed heart failure due to hysteria. The doctor offered condolences and left another bottle on the nightstand, just in case the mother needed help sleeping. The house returned to quiet, though it was not peace. The mirrors were covered, the room locked, and the family name never mentioned in connection with what had happened. To society, they were blameless. To themselves, they were haunted. The empire moved on, the factory bells rang, and another bottle was sold to another household. The tragedy was ordinary. That was what made it monstrous. A father trying to save his daughter. A doctor following his training. Society mistaking obedience for care. No villains, only rituals, each as fatal as the last. In the polished streets above, people still spoke of progress, while beneath them, in the quiet rooms of ordinary homes, the drug continued its quiet work of unmaking lives. The family tied her down to keep her safe, never realizing they were fastening her to the very thing that was killing her. Laudanum had turned protection into punishment, devotion into destruction. Her madness was not born from sin or frailty, but from the empire's faith in its own medicine. After her death, the mirrors were draped in black, yet their surfaces still reflected what no one dared face, that every household had the same bottle, waiting, and every father believed he was doing what was right. At the turn of the century, the headlines began to shift. Beneath the advertisements for soap and corsets, small articles started to appear with uneasy titles. A curious increase in female nervous disorders, the epidemic of delicate minds, women losing their reason in numbers. The words were careful, wrapped in politeness, yet something inside them trembled. Doctors wrote anonymously to the papers, describing strange cases that had become too frequent to ignore. Wives, mothers, and daughters of good standing suddenly collapsing into hysteria, delirium, or silence. Their letters carried both curiosity and fear. They sensed a pattern, but dared not name it. It is almost darkly funny that a nation so obsessed with class and clarity could stare at an epidemic for decades and still refuse to admit what caused it. The reports came from every corner of the Empire: London, Bath, Manchester, Edinburgh. Middle-class women, once models of composure, were being admitted to private hospitals in record numbers. The doctors called it collective nervous breakdown, a phrase that sounded clinical enough to hide the chaos behind it. Some spoke of emotional contagion, others blamed the stress of modern womanhood. None mentioned laudanum, though nearly every patient had a bottle of it on her bedside table. If this were today, it would be like hospitals filling with overdoses, while every newspaper called it a mystery of female emotion instead of addiction. The Empire had learned to bury truth under the elegance of language. I find it unbearable to imagine those newspapers lying neatly on breakfast tables, their quiet horror tucked between the weather report and the theatre schedule. The readers, mostly men, sipped their tea and nodded in concern over the decline of female sanity, never suspecting that the same medicine prescribed to their wives was the cause. To them, it was a matter of discipline, not danger. A woman's mind, they said, was too easily disturbed by the pressures of life, reading too much, thinking too deeply, wanting too often. The doctors reinforced this belief by calling addiction weakness and withdrawal temperament. What they could not control, they redefined. The anonymous articles grew bolder. One doctor wrote of visiting a patient who had not spoken in months, her fingers stained from the cork of a medicine bottle she refused to let go. Another described a woman who believed the wallpaper whispered her name. The descriptions were vivid but detached, as though the writers were chronicling natural curiosities instead of human suffering. They spoke of an epidemic among respectable women, but not of the poison sold to them by apothecaries on every corner. The silence was deliberate. To name laudanum would mean confronting the entire structure of Victorian medicine and its complicity. Among the few who dared, a handful of reformers began publishing pamphlets that questioned the morality of the trade. They used words like enslavement and chemical bondage, but their warnings were drowned out by ridicule. The medical journals mocked them as sentimental, accusing them of exaggeration. The newspapers printed their names alongside caricatures of hysterical women clutching bottles. Respectability had more power than truth. So long as the drug remained an emblem of refinement, it could not be a scandal. In private letters between physicians, the unease deepened. They admitted that more and more female patients were arriving with identical symptoms: trembling, confusion, and unrelenting despair. But they also confessed that they had prescribed the same medicine to each of them. One doctor wrote, "It appears that the cure has become the disease, but what man dares confess such a crime against his own profession?" The letter was never published. He retired quietly a year later. Silence was safer than honesty. Public fascination grew. Society began treating women's madness as entertainment. Newspapers reported dramatic cases with theatrical flair, a lady running naked through the gardens of her estate. A governess found muttering scripture in the marketplace, a widow attempting to drown herself in a fountain. Readers devoured these stories the way they consumed gossip, unaware that they were reading symptoms, not scandals. The term female epidemic became fashionable in conversation, discussed with the same detachment as fashion or weather. For the women themselves, there was no voice, no defence. Their suffering was described about them, never by them. The same press that reported their collapse would also publish recipes for tonics to calm the female nerves, most of which contained opium. It was a perfect circle of commerce and hypocrisy, the disease advertised beside the cure beside the denial. The empire had built an entire economy around the silence of its women, and the newspapers were its hymns. In drawing rooms and tea circles, readers pretended to care. They sighed over the tragedy of it all, murmuring that perhaps women were not meant for the strain of modern life. The discussions always ended with a smile, a new topic, and another sip of tea. No one spoke of the bottles in their own cabinets. The scandal was easier to admire from afar. Truth, after all, was a luxury reserved for the poor, not the polite. Eventually, the headlines faded, the novelty wore off, replaced by new distractions, wars, inventions, and royal scandals. The epidemic of madness slipped quietly back into the shadows of respectability. By the time the 20th century arrived, it had already been rewritten as history, its victims remembered as nervous women of a bygone age. The empire congratulated itself on its progress, never realizing that the same patterns had simply evolved, not disappeared. The doctors who once wrote anonymous letters lived long enough to see their warnings forgotten. The reformers who had spoken out were dismissed as eccentrics. The women themselves were buried under marble headstones that said nothing of what killed them. The truth remained where it always had, in the empty bottles left behind on their dressing tables, the quiet monuments to a society that valued calm more than life. The newspapers had called it an epidemic of madness, but the real sickness was denial. The empire documented its own crimes as curiosity, wrote its victim into cautionary tales, and printed them between advertisements for more poison. The ink itself became part of the lie. When the presses cooled each night, the streets fell silent, yet behind closed doors, the bottles still glimmered under the lamplight. In those quiet homes, another woman lifted her spoon, unaware that tomorrow's headline had already been written about her. By the final years of the 19th century, the empire had begun to stir from its long, drugged sleep. The warnings appeared first in medical journals, then in cautious editorials, written by men who had once defended the same substances they now condemned. Their tone was moral, not merciful. They spoke of the corruption of womanhood, of fallen mothers, and the decline of moral fibre. It was as if the drug itself had never existed, only the weakness of those who succumbed to it. Laudanum and morphine were suddenly being discussed as societal threats, yet no one admitted how deeply they had been woven into everyday life. It is almost absurd that a nation could poison its women for half a century and then act shocked to discover they were ill. The outrage arrived too late, like a priest arriving at a house long after the candles had burned down. By then, countless women had already vanished behind the curtains of polite silence. Some were buried quietly under marble stones, their epitaphs speaking only of virtue and patience. Others remained alive but hollowed, living in the half-light of withdrawal, their minds dulled beyond recovery. They drifted through their homes like ghosts, wearing the same gowns, sitting at the same pianos, speaking in murmurs. Their families called them melancholic, not addicted. Their doctors used phrases like nervous exhaustion. The empire preferred euphemisms to guilt. If it happened today, it would be like discovering an entire generation of women sedated by prescription drugs, while officials issued reports blaming hysteria instead of profit. The pattern has never changed. Only the labels have. There is something quietly cruel about how society wakes only when the damage is irreversible. When laws finally appeared, they were framed not to protect women, but to preserve order. The sale of morphine and opium was restricted, but addiction was treated as a moral failure. Women who confessed dependence were shunned. Families hid their suffering relatives out of shame, fearful of penny. Addiction became a secret illness, whispered about behind lace curtains. The empire that had once sold bottles openly on street corners now pretended it had nothing to do with them. In the hospitals, new wards were opened for female degenerates. The air smelled of carbolic acid and damp linen. Women arrived trembling, their bodies fighting to survive without the drug. Many did not. The withdrawal was agonizing, with hallucinations, vomiting, and uncontrollable shaking. Some begged to die. The nurses wrote their names into ledgers, marking deaths as self-inflicted weakness. The public preferred to see punishment rather than tragedy. The newspapers printed moral lessons instead of obituaries. The same society that had once encouraged women to soothe themselves now condemned them for the results. Doctors who had once made fortunes from prescribing laudanum began to reinvent themselves as reformers. They gave speeches about the dangers of dependency, conveniently forgetting their role in creating it. They published pamphlets with titles like The Perils of the Modern Woman's Medicine Cabinet, claiming that female vanity had led to the crisis. There was no mention of profit, no confession of complicity. Respectability required selective memory. The empire had always been skilled at turning guilt into virtue. In households across England, medicine cabinets were quietly emptied. Bottles were buried in gardens, poured into drains, or hidden in drawers. But even as one generation tried to purge the poison, another began to depend on new forms of it. Chloroform for sleep, morphine for pain, alcohol for sorrow. The substance changed, but the need remained. Women were still expected to be calm, graceful, and uncomplaining. And so, they still reached for whatever could silence the noise inside. The empire may have banned the drug, but it never cured the reason it had thrived. The early reformers, mostly women, tried to speak out, but their words carried little weight. They wrote essays in small journals describing the loss of sisters and friends. Their tone was gentle, full of grief rather than anger. They spoke not of sin but of suffering, urging society to see addiction as illness, not immorality. Few listened. Charity committees preferred to focus on fallen women who could be saved by prayer and discipline. Medicine was still a man's world, and women's pain was still treated as an exaggeration. In time, the story of the laudanum epidemic became a kind of moral fable. Mothers told their daughters to be cautious with medicines, not because of chemistry but because of virtue. The drug itself was rewritten as a cautionary symbol detached from its history of industrial exploitation. The empire managed to preserve its pride even in disgrace. It had poisoned half its population and still called itself enlightened. The irony is that the laws passed at the end of the century did little to save lives. They merely shifted responsibility. Pharmacies kept selling diluted forms of the same substances under new names. Patients still begged for relief and doctors still obliged. The bottles became smaller, the labels more discreet, but the contents remained unchanged. The only difference was silence. Addiction moved from the marketplace to the home, hidden deeper than before. In the parlours of the upper class, women who had once been called hysterical were now called invalids. They lived behind closed doors, tended by servants, forgotten by the world. Their decline was no longer seen as a scandal but as misfortune. The empire had learned to pity what it could not cure, and pity, as history has shown, is just another form of distance. Late in the century, a journalist finally published a piece titled "The Poison That Lulled a Nation." It caused a brief sensation, then faded like all things that threaten comfort. People wanted progress, not accountability. The story became another ghost wandering through time, visible for a moment, then gone. The bottles, however, never disappeared. They can still be found in antique shops today, their glass clouded, their labels faint, relics of a century that preferred ignorance to guilt. By the time the empire admitted what it had done, the damage had already become its legacy. The women who had died were never counted, the survivors never named. Society had awakened, but the house was already empty. In the quiet that followed, those who remained learned to live without the drug. Though never without the memory of its comfort, somewhere in that uneasy silence, a new century began, one that promised progress but carried the same hunger beneath its skin. They buried them quietly. No processions, no flowers, no hymns that carried their names. The graves were dug in the far corners of cemeteries, where the grass grew long and the soil turned to mud after rain. Families requested no headstones, fearing that recognition would invite whispers. In Victorian England, a woman's madness was not a tragedy, it was a stain. The doctors had declared them hopeless cases, the churches called them fallen, and the neighbours spoke of them only in lowered voices. It is both cruel and absurd that the same society that praised female purity also erased the women it had destroyed, as if shame could serve as redemption. The records of these deaths were brief and impersonal. Exhaustion, nervous collapse, self-inflicted distress, never the word addiction, never the word laudanum. The paper covered everything that conscience could not. In many parishes, the registers were kept deliberately vague, a favour to families of good standing. Some women were entered under initials instead of names, their final trace reduced to a single letter. The silence was institutional, carefully tended by both clergy and physicians. If this happened today, it would be like hospitals quietly labelling overdose victims as emotional fatalities, pretending the cause was feelings instead of poison. Respectability demanded forgetting, and forgetting became the cleanest grave of all. I can almost picture those unmarked plots on a grey afternoon, the earth cold and uneven, the wind bending the grass, no sign that a human life once burned and vanished there. The families rarely visited. Some sent servants to check the site, others never returned at all. Mourning was a privilege reserved for the blameless. For women who had lost their minds, there was only disappearance. Their absence became easier to bear than their existence. Society had taught everyone to look away, to preserve the illusion that decency was untouched by decay. In the cities, the new cemeteries expanded to accommodate the quiet dead. Rows of anonymous mounds stood beside ornate monuments carved for husbands, fathers, and sons. The contrast was unbearable. Men who profited from the trade of laudanum were honoured with marble angels, while the women they had condemned to silence lay beneath unmarked soil. Grave diggers knew the difference. They whispered about the ladies without names, noting how many came from good families, how many were buried at night to avoid attention. But whispers were not evidence, and evidence was the one thing society refused to collect. There were women whose families fled to the countryside to hide their disgrace. They carried the bodies in plain wooden coffins, sometimes claiming the death was due to fever or childbirth. The truth was left behind in city hospitals, sealed in records that no one would ever read. Even after death, their bodies were handled as inconveniences, disposed of quietly, efficiently, and without acknowledgement. The doctors had moved on to new patients, the apothecaries to new profits. Only the soil remembered them, and even the soil, in time, forgot. The cemeteries became strange places of contradiction. The wealthiest plots glimmered with granite and gold lettering, while just beyond them lay patches of earth without markers. Visitors walking through might assume they were unused spaces, never realizing they stood over the remains of women whose only crime was believing their medicine was safe. Some locals claimed they could feel a heaviness there, as if the air itself was thick with unfinished stories. Others said that flowers refused to grow. It was superstition, perhaps, but one rooted in guilt. By the turn of the century, the unmarked graves had multiplied. Reformers began to notice. A few journalists tried to investigate, searching parish maps and burial lists, but the trails ended abruptly. The church claimed privacy, the hospitals claimed confidentiality, and the families refused comment. A woman's death was personal, they said, but the truth was collective, a quiet epidemic buried under morality and fear. The empire had perfected the art of concealment. Every grave was a footnote to a lie, in museums today. You can sometimes find the bottles, small, brown, and harmless looking. Their labels faded but still legible, for restless nerves, for female weakness, for sleep. They sit behind glass, displayed as curiosities from a distant past, but the women who drank from them are nowhere to be found. There are no portraits, no diaries, no epitaphs. History remembers their husbands' professions, their fathers' estates, but not their names. They were erased twice, first by the drug, then by the silence that followed it. The saddest part is how normal it all seemed. No one thought the absence strange. Cemeteries were full of unnamed women, and the world kept turning. Death, when attached to womanhood, was always assumed to be quiet, natural and self-contained. The empire's conscience remained spotless because it never looked down. It built its greatness upon the foundations of oblivion, trading memory for convenience. Each unmarked grave became a symbol of something larger, the way society consumes its women's pain, sanitizes it, and buries it beneath propriety. There is a certain poetry to that cruelty, the transformation of suffering into silence, of life into decorum. These women were not mourned because mourning would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have shattered the illusion of purity. Better, then, to let them vanish and pretend the earth had always been empty. The unmarked graves did not hold only bodies, they held everything the empire refused to confess. They were the burial ground of denial, where names, shame, and memory were all laid to rest together. Each plot was a sentence cut short, each silence a monument to complicity. Beneath those patches of grass, the century's quietest crime continued to breathe, waiting, still, to be spoken aloud. They said the women went mad, that they laughed at nothing, cried for no reason, and spoke to things no one else could see. But those who said it never looked closely enough to notice the bottles on their tables, the trembling in their hands, or the dull glassy calm in their eyes. Madness was easier to name than guilt. It was a convenient story for a world that refused to see its own cruelty reflected in its victims. The women were not born unstable, they were made that way, one measured dose at a time. Society gave them the poison, then called their collapse a symptom. It is both tragic and strangely neat how an empire could destroy its women and still consider itself moral. The doctors claimed science. They believed they were soothing nerves, balancing temperaments, saving marriages. They never questioned why their patients were always women or why their remedies required silence. The medicine was prescribed for every discomfort of femininity: pain, sadness, desire, dandy's obedience, a spoonful in the morning, a few drops at night, and the problem disappeared. The woman grew softer, slower, quieter. To the world, she seemed improved. To herself, she began to vanish. If we saw this today, it would look like a nation feeding antidepressants to every restless wife and calling it care. The forms change, but the logic remains: calm her, dull her, preserve the peace. I find it haunting how civilized the cruelty appeared. There were no chains, no shouting, no violence, only glass bottles, lace curtains, and polite instructions written in elegant cursive. The empire did not need prisons, it had prescriptions. Each home became its own asylum, each woman her own patient. What they called a cure was only control disguised as compassion. The empire taught its women that gentleness was survival. In return, it demanded they swallow obedience in liquid form. The slow deaths were invisible. Women faded into comfortable chairs, surrounded by teacups and embroidery. They stared at the walls for hours, murmuring prayers they no longer understood. Families called it exhaustion. Doctors called it hysteria cured. The city called it normal. There was no reason to suspect murder when the victims looked so peaceful. Yet every one of them had the same story: an ache, a bottle, a doctor's reassurance, and a steady descent into oblivion. Some fought back for a time. They threw the bottles away, endured the shaking, the nightmares, the cravings, but without support. Most returned. The body remembers dependency as comfort. The mind learns to love what numbs it. In the end, even rebellion became part of the cycle. A brief flicker before the darkness. Husbands welcomed their surrender. Society applauded their composure. Religion blessed their patience. And history, ever selective, called them tragic instead of wronged. As the years passed, the story hardened into myth. The madwoman in the attic, the melancholic wife, the fragile mother. Each was a reflection of a real woman who had once tried to stay alive under chemical sleep. The myth preserved the shame while erasing the cause. Even literature betrayed them, turning their pain into cautionary tales about emotion and excess. The empire loved them as symbols, not as people. It honoured their destruction with fiction and forgot their truth with convenience. By the time the 19th century ended, the empire had begun to doubt itself. A few doctors confessed that laudanum had been overprescribed, but none apologised. Pharmacies changed labels, lowered doses, and invented new names. Morphine became chloral hydrate, then sleeping powders, then tonics for rest. The bottles changed colour, the script changed style, but the purpose endured: to calm, to quiet, to contain. The same cure, dressed for a new century, and so the women kept drinking. They aged behind curtains, tended gardens, hosted teas, and lived half awake. Some wrote diaries full of blurred handwriting, confessing they could no longer tell dreams from days. Others left no words at all. They died with dignity, which was another word for silence. The empire admired that silence. It called it strength, patience, devotion. It could not see that it was the sound of surrender. There is a cruel symmetry to it all. The drug that robbed them of thought also erased their anger, leaving behind only the kind of quiet the world rewards. It was the perfect crime: no violence, no blood, no witnesses, and no outcry. Civilization continued untouched, proud of its morals, proud of its women who never spoke too loudly, and beneath that pride lay an unmarked graveyard of minds gently dismantled by trust. If history had listened instead of diagnosing, perhaps it would have named them differently. They were not hysterical, nor weak, nor cursed. They were faithful. They believed the men who told them the medicine was good, the priests who told them obedience was holy, the newspapers that told them beauty required calmness. Faith, in the end, was what killed them. And faith is what keeps the same story repeating in new forms, even now. When I imagine their final moments, I see not madness but clarity, a flicker before the light goes out. Perhaps a woman sits by a window, the bottle beside her, her breathing slow. She hears the street outside, the hooves of carriages, the laughter of children. She understands, for the first time, what has been taken from her, and yet she is too tired to curse it. The poison has done its work perfectly. It has made even rage feel distant, almost irrelevant. She closes her eyes not because she wants to, but because there is nothing left to see. The empire stands proud above her, still calling itself enlightened. It writes its histories and builds its monuments, never once mentioning the quiet epidemic that made its peace possible. The real ghosts of the Victorian age are not those that haunt its Gothic houses, but the women who smiled through sedation, the mothers who forgot their own names, the daughters who mistook numbness for serenity. They were called mad only because they could no longer pretend. Even now, their story feels unfinished. Every generation finds new ways to repeat it, with pills instead of potions, with gentle words instead of prescriptions, but the result is the same. The world still asks women to disappear gracefully. It rewards quietness, punishes defiance, and calls endurance elegance. Perhaps that is why their silence lingers. It is not history, it is inheritance. To call them mad is to absolve the society that built the walls around them. To call them victims is to risk seeing ourselves in their reflection. They were not symbols, they were people. They trusted, they obeyed, they suffered, and they vanished. The least we can do is name what really happened. They were poisoned while awake. They were not mad. They were betrayed. Their bodies became experiments in obedience. Their deaths the cost of a nation's calm. The empire called them fragile, but it was fragility by design. The women were never insane. They were witnesses to what happens when comfort becomes a weapon, and silence becomes the only virtue left, and those long, quiet sleeps lasted forever. Good night, listener. Let your rest be gentle, and your thoughts your own. May your dreams drift far from the empire's ghosts, where no one mistakes your silence for peace. Sleep deeply in safety and wake whole in the morning light.